Good evening, and welcome to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where ancient whispers guide you into peaceful slumber. I'm your narrator for tonight's journey, and I invite you to settle deeply into your most comfortable space. Perhaps you're nestled in your favorite chair or already tucked beneath warm blankets. Take a moment now to let your shoulders drop, allow your breathing to slow, and prepare to drift away from the concerns of today. Tonight, we embark on a voyage that will carry you far from the familiar world, downstream along the great river Nile, past the towering pyramids of Giza, beyond the temples of Luxor, into a realm where golden sands meet black granite cliffs, where the desert whispers secrets of forgotten kingdoms. We travel to Nubia, a land whose very name means land of gold, where powerful rulers once wore crowns of gleaming metal and commanded empires that stretched across the heart of Africa. Close your eyes now, and let me paint for you the scene. As twilight settles over the Nile's southern reaches, the air grows cooler as we drift past the first cataract, where the great river tumbles over ancient rocks worn smooth by millennia of flowing water. Here, the landscape changes dramatically. Gone are the familiar palms and fertile fields of Lower Egypt. In their place rise dramatic cliffs of red sandstone and black granite, carved into fantastic shapes by wind and time. The sun hangs low on the western horizon, casting everything in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in the distance, barely visible through the desert haze, stand the silhouettes of pyramids, not the massive monuments you might expect, but smaller, more elegant structures, with steep sides that catch and hold the dying light. These are the Pyramids of Nubia, over 200 of them scattered across present-day Sudan, more than are found in Egypt, each one marking the resting place of a king or queen, whose name echoes still in the desert wind. This is our destination tonight. This mysterious realm that existed alongside ancient Egypt for thousands of years, sometimes as rival, sometimes as conqueror, always as equal. For you see, Nubian rulers once wore the double crown of Egypt itself, ruling as pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, the so-called Black Pharaohs who governed both kingdoms for nearly a century. But I'm getting ahead of our story. Let us begin properly, as all good tales should begin, at the very beginning, when the world was younger, and the Nile ran fuller than it does today. Picture, if you will, the Africa of 4,000 years ago. The Sahara Desert, now a vast sea of sand, was then a grassland, dotted with lakes and crossed by rivers. Herders moved their cattle across green plains, following seasonal rains. And along the life-giving Nile, in the region the Egyptians called Ta-Seti, meaning land of the bow, for the skilled archers who lived there, communities were growing into something remarkable. Here, where the river carved its way through Nubia's granite cliffs, creating a series of cataracts that made navigation challenging, a unique civilization was taking shape. The kingdoms of Kerma, flourishing from about 2400 BCE to 1500 BCE, and later Kush, which ruled from about 1000 BCE to 300 CE, emerged along the Nile River, prospering due to their productive agriculture and the region's abundant natural resources. People who built these kingdoms were tall and strong, their skin dark as polished ebony, their hair adorned with gold and ivory. They were master craftsmen, working metals with a skill that amazed their neighbors. They were fierce warriors, whose arrows could find their mark at distances that seemed impossible. And they were wise rulers, who understood that true power came not just from force of arms, but from the ability to bring diverse peoples together under a single banner. As you rest now, letting your body sink deeper into comfort, imagine yourself standing on the banks of the Nile at sunset 4 millennia ago. The air is warm, but not oppressive, carrying the scent of river water and acacia blossoms. Somewhere nearby, a craftsman works at his forge, the ring of hammer on metal providing a rhythmic counterpoint to the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. a trading vessel glides past, its sail full of the evening breeze, heading north, toward Egypt with a cargo of gold dust and ivory, ebony logs, and precious stones. The traders aboard speak in languages that would sound strange to modern ears, but their purpose is universal and timeless, connecting distant lands through commerce and exchange of ideas. In the distance, rising from a foundation of massive mud brick walls, stands a city unlike any in the ancient world. This is Kerma, the first great capital of Nubia, a metropolis that could rival Memphis or Thebes in its grandeur. Its towering defenses stretch for miles, encompassing not just palaces and temples, but workshops and granaries, residential districts, and royal gardens. At its heart stands a structure the archaeologists would later call the Western Defufa, a temple of mud brick that rises like an artificial mountain from the desert floor. But Kerma is more than just a city. It is a statement, a declaration that here in the south, beyond the traditional borders of Egyptian influence, another civilization has found its voice. Here, kings rule who bow to no pharaoh, who command their own armies and conduct their own diplomacy, who bury their dead according to their own ancient customs and worship their gods in their own magnificent temples. As the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, reflected like jewels on the surface of the Nile, we can sense the weight of history settling around us like a comfortable blanket. This is a land where every stone has a story to tell, where every grain of sand has witnessed the march of armies and the passage of caravans, the rise and fall of dynasties, the eternal cycle of life and death and rebirth that defines all human experience. Tonight, as we journey together through the whispers of Nubia, we will encounter warrior queens who led their armies into battle against the might of Rome itself. We will walk through palaces where black-skinned pharaohs held court, wearing the sacred uraeus serpent on their brows, ruling over an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. We will explore burial chambers filled with golden treasures and decipher inscriptions written in scripts that scholars are only now beginning to understand. But more than that, we will discover a civilization that challenges our assumptions about the ancient world, a kingdom that reminds us that power and wisdom, art and learning, have never been the exclusive province of any single people or place. The Nubians were partners with the Egyptians in creating one of humanity's greatest civilizations, and their story deserves to be told with the same reverence and wonder we reserve for the most famous pharaohs of the North. So settle in now, dear listener, and let the gentle current of the Nile carry you southward into a realm where golden pyramids pierce the desert sky and the voices of ancient kings and queens still echo in the wind. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we prepare to enter the first chapter of our story, where we will meet the mysterious people who built the Kingdom of Kerma, the first to truly challenge the might of Egypt itself. The night is young, and we have many miles to travel before dawn. Trust in the ancient rhythms of the river, in the timeless dance of stars across the African sky, and allow yourself to drift into the embrace of history itself. For in the whispers of Nubia, in the silence, between the desert winds, lies a story that will carry you gently into the most peaceful of dreams. The desert wind carries with it not just grains of sand, but whispers of identity, echoes of a people who called themselves something quite different from what their neighbors named them. As you rest comfortably, breathing slowly and steadily, let me tell you about a remarkable civilization that emerged from the meeting place of river and desert, a people whose story begins not with conquest or dramatic founding myths, but with the simple, profound act of making a home in one of the world's most challenging landscapes. The ancient Egyptians, those master builders and chroniclers, had many names for their southern neighbors. They called the land Sasedi, land of the bow, a tribute to the legendary archery skills of its inhabitants. Later, they would use the term Ta-Nehesi, land of the Nubians, though the word Nubian itself comes from the Egyptian nub, meaning gold, for this was indeed a land rich beyond measure in that most precious of metals. But what did these people call themselves? Like so many voices from antiquity, their own words for their identity have been largely lost to time, buried beneath layers of sand and centuries of silence. What we do know is that they were never a single unified people, but rather a tapestry of communities, kingdoms, and cultures, each with its own traditions, its own dialects, its own relationship with the great river that gave them all life. Imagine, as your breathing continues to slow and deepen, the vast stretch of the Nile Valley, as it existed 3,000 years before our modern era. From the first cataract at Aswan, where massive granite boulders create rapids that make navigation treacherous, all the way south to where the blue and white Nile converge at modern Khartoum. This was Nubian territory. It was a land of contrasts. So dramatic they seemed to belong to different worlds entirely docked in the north, where the river carved its way through the Nubian sandstone. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving. Here, the Nile flowed through a series of cataracts, 6 great barriers of stone that divided the river into distinct sections. Each cataract presented its own challenges to travelers, requiring intimate knowledge of seasonal water levels, hidden rocks, and secret channels known only to local guides. This natural fortress-like quality of the land would prove crucial to Nubian independence throughout their long history. But travel south from these rocky barriers, and the landscape transforms into something altogether more welcoming. Here, in the region that would become the heartland of the Kingdom of Kush, the river spreads wider, creating fertile islands and broad floodplains perfect for agriculture. Sorghum and millet grew in abundance, while date palms provided both fruit and shade. Cattle grazed on grasslands that, in those distant times, stretched much further from the river than they do today. That the people who made their homes in this varied landscape were as diverse as the land itself. In the desert regions between the Nile and the Red Sea, nomadic tribes followed ancient caravan routes, their camels laden with goods from the interior of Africa. These were the Blemis and Nobates, peoples whose names appear in Egyptian records as sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, always formidable opponents when roused to war. Along the river itself, in settlements that grew from simple farming villages into prosperous towns and eventually into royal capitals, lived the people who would build the great kingdoms we remember today. They were tall and strong, these river dwellers, their skin dark as polished wood, their hair often braided in elaborate patterns that indicated their status, their clan affiliations, their personal achievements. Archaeological evidence tells us that these Nubian communities were remarkably sophisticated from a very early period. Pottery found in settlements dating back to 3500 BCE shows a level of artistry and technical skill that rivals anything produced in Egypt during the same period. These were not primitive people slowly advancing toward civilization, but accomplished craftsmen and artists who had developed their own distinctive styles and techniques. Their relationship with their Egyptian neighbors to the north was complex and ever-changing, like the flow of the Nile itself during flood season. Sometimes the two peoples lived in peace, trading gold and ivory from the south for grain and manufactured goods from the north. Egyptian records speak of Nubian soldiers serving in pharaonic armies, their archery skills making them invaluable, allies in campaigns against common enemies. But peace was not always possible between peoples, separated by such different worldviews and competing interests. The Egyptians, with their highly centralized kingdom and their belief in the divine nature of pharaonic rule, often viewed their southern neighbors as barbarians in need of civilizing influence. The Nubians, proud and independent, with their own gods and their own traditions of leadership, resisted these efforts at cultural domination. The earliest Nubian kingdom to emerge as a true rival to Egyptian power was Kerma, which flourished from about 2400 to 1500 BC in the region between the second and third cataracts. The city of Kerma, whose massive mud brick ruins still rise from the desert floor today, was a marvel of ancient urban planning. Its defensive walls stretched for miles, encompassing not just royal palaces and temples, but entire residential districts, workshops where craftsmen produced goods for trade throughout the ancient world, and storage facilities that could hold grain and other supplies sufficient to withstand lengthy sieges. At the heart of Kerma stood the Western Defufa, a massive temple complex built entirely of mud brick that rose over 60 feet above the surrounding desert. This was no mere copy of Egyptian architecture, but something uniquely Nubian, a structure that combined practical defensive considerations with profound religious symbolism. From its summit, guards could watch for approaching enemies across miles of open desert, while within its chambers, priests conducted rituals that connected the people of Kerma to forces far older than any pharaonic dynasty. The rulers of Kerma were not pharaohs in the Egyptian sense, but they were no less powerful for that difference. They controlled trade routes that stretched deep into the heart of Africa, bringing gold and ivory, exotic animals and rare woods northward to the Mediterranean world. In return, they acquired not just material goods, but ideas, technologies, and artistic influences that they adapted to their own purposes. As the centuries passed and Kerma eventually declined, new powers arose to take its place. The kingdom of Kush, centered first at Napata near the Fourth Cataract and later at Meroë further south, would become the most successful of all Nubian states. Under Kushite rule, Nubians would not merely resist Egyptian influence, but would actually conquer Egypt itself, ruling as legitimate pharaohs for nearly a century. But we are getting ahead of ourselves in our story. For now, as you rest in perfect comfort, your body growing heavier with each breath, simply let yourself absorb the fundamental truth about these remarkable people. The Nubians were not a footnote to Egyptian history, not a primitive people slowly awakening to civilization under foreign influence. They were the creators of their own distinct and sophisticated culture, equal partners in the great conversation of ancient civilizations that shaped the world we know today. In the gentle darkness behind your closed eyelids, picture the Nile, flowing endlessly northward, carrying with it not just the waters that would make Egypt fertile, but the dreams and ambitions of peoples whose names we are only now beginning to recover from the silence of the desert. Tomorrow's sunrise will illuminate temples and pyramids that stand as testament to their achievements. But tonight, in the peaceful space between sleeping and waking, we honor simply their presence, their persistence, their profound humanity. Wind across the cataracts whispers their stories still, if we know how to listen. And we are listening now, you and I, as we prepare to enter the next chapter of their remarkable saga. In the soft embrace of evening, as your breathing finds its natural rhythm and your body settles into perfect stillness, let us journey back nearly 4,000 years to witness the rise of a city that would challenge the very foundations of Egyptian power. Picture, if you will, a vast construction site on the banks of the Nile, where thousands of workers move with purposeful determination under the African sun, building something the world has never seen before. This is Kerma in its golden age, around 1750 BCE, and what these ancient architects and laborers are creating is nothing less than one of Africa's first great urban centers. A city that emerges from their efforts will stretch for miles along the riverbank, protected by walls so massive that their ruins still inspire awe today, 4 millennia after the last brick was laid. The name Kerma itself has become synonymous with an entire civilization, but to the people who built it, this was simply home, the beating heart of a kingdom that controlled trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to the heart of equatorial Africa. As you rest now, feeling the gentle pull of sleep beginning to work its magic, Allow yourself to walk through this ancient metropolis at the height of its power and prosperity. The first thing that would strike any visitor approaching Kerma from the north was the sheer scale of its defenses. The city walls rose from foundations of massive stone blocks, their mud brick superstructure reaching heights that seemed to touch the sky. These were not merely protective barriers, but statements of power and permanence, declarations that here stood a people who intended to endure for all time. The construction techniques employed by Kerma's builders were sophisticated beyond anything found in other ancient cities. Rather than simply piling brick upon brick, they created a complex system of chambers and galleries within the walls themselves, providing not just structural strength, but also storage spaces for grain, weapons, and precious goods. During times of siege, these hidden chambers could sustain the city's population for months or even years, but Kerma was far more than a fortress. As you passed through its great gates, moving along streets that were carefully planned and expertly maintained, you would find yourself in a thriving commercial center where goods from across the New World changed hands daily. Here, Egyptian merchants haggled over prices for Nubian gold and ivory, while traders from the mysterious lands far to the south displayed carved wooden masks and exotic animal skins that would eventually find their way to pharaonic courts. Residential districts of Kerma tell us much about the sophisticated social organization of this ancient kingdom. Archaeological excavations have revealed neighborhoods laid out according to strict urban planning principles, with houses of different sizes and degrees of luxury indicating a complex class system. The homes of wealthy merchants and royal officials were spacious compounds built around central courtyards, their walls decorated with painted murals depicting scenes from daily life and religious ceremonies. Even the humblest dwellings in Kerma showed evidence of prosperity and artistic sensibility. That was remarkable for its time. Pottery found in these modest homes displays a level of craftsmanship and aesthetic sophistication that rivals anything produced in contemporary Egypt. The distinctive black-topped red ceramic ware of Kerma became so prized that examples have been found in archaeological sites throughout the ancient Near East. At the very heart of the city stood the Western Defufa, a structure so imposing that early archaeologists mistook it for a natural hill. This massive temple complex, built entirely of mud brick, rose in terraced levels to a height of over 60 feet, its walls so thick that entire chambers were carved within them. The Defufa was not merely a religious center, but the symbolic and practical seat of Kerma's power, a place where earthly authority and divine sanction merged into a single, overwhelming presence. The rulers who commanded from this mud brick mountain were unlike any other monarchs of their age. While their Egyptian contemporaries claimed divine status as living gods, the kings of Kerma ruled through a more complex relationship with both their people and their deities. They were warrior leaders who had proven themselves in battle, religious figures who maintained the favor of the gods through elaborate ceremonies, and master diplomats who negotiated as equals with the mightiest pharaohs of Egypt. The burial practices of Kerma's elite reveal the true extent of their power and wealth. Royal tombs discovered by archaeologists contained not just the mummified remains of kings and queens, but entire retinues of servants, soldiers, and craftsmen who were sacrificed to accompany their rulers into the afterlife. These mass burials, while shocking to modern sensibilities, demonstrate the absolute authority wielded by Kerma's monarchs and the devotion they commanded from their subjects. Perhaps most remarkably, the tombs also contained evidence of Kerma's far-reaching trade connections and cultural sophistication. Alongside traditional African goods like leopard skins and elephant ivory, archaeologists have found Mediterranean pottery, Asian silk, and metalwork showing influences from as far away as Mesopotamia. This was a cosmopolitan kingdom, open to ideas and influences from across the ancient world while maintaining its own distinct identity. The military might of Kerma was legendary throughout the ancient Near East, Egyptian records speak with grudging. Respective Nubian archers whose accuracy and range seemed almost supernatural. These warriors, armed with bows made from the finest African hardwoods and arrows tipped with iron points, could reportedly hit targets at distances that amazed their enemies. Entire Egyptian military campaigns were planned around the challenge of facing Kerma's deadly accurate bowmen. But Kerma's power rested on more than military prowess alone. The kingdom controlled the gold mines of the eastern desert, sources of wealth that made its rulers among the richest people on earth. More importantly, Kerma commanded the trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. Caravans carrying precious goods from the interior had to pass through Kerma's territory, and the taxes and tribute they paid provided a steady stream of revenue that funded the kingdom's magnificent architecture and powerful military. Relationship between Kerma and Egypt was one of the most complex and dynamic in the ancient world. At times, the two kingdoms were bitter enemies, fighting savage wars that devastated the borderlands between them. Egyptian pharaohs launched massive military campaigns against Kerma, while Nubian raiders struck deep into Egyptian territory, carrying away captives and treasure that would enrich the southern kingdom for generations. Yet there were also long periods of peace and cooperation, when Egyptian and Nubian merchants worked together to mutual benefit, when diplomatic marriages linked the royal houses, and when soldiers from both kingdoms served side by side in campaigns against common enemies. The cultural exchange during these peaceful interludes enriched both civilizations, creating hybrid art forms and religious practices that would influence the entire region for centuries to come. As the stars wheel overhead and your breathing grows ever deeper and more regular, let yourself imagine the final glory days of ancient Kerma, around 1500 BCE, when this remarkable city reached the absolute peak of its power and influence. In the cool evening air, the great Defufa catches the last light of sunset, its massive walls glowing like burnished bronze. Somewhere in the distance, a temple drum beats the rhythm for evening prayers, while the gentle splash of oars marks the passage of trading vessels on the Nile. This was a civilization that had achieved something remarkable in human history. Balance between power and prosperity, between tradition and innovation, between local identity and international engagement. The people of Kerma had created not just a successful kingdom, but a way of life that honored both their African heritage and their role as bridges between different worlds. But like all human achievements, Kerma's glory was not destined to last forever. The great city would eventually fall to Egyptian conquest, its walls breached, its treasures carried away to northern palaces. Yet something essential survived that destruction, something that would eventually give birth to an even greater Nubian kingdom, one that would not merely resist Egyptian power, but would actually conquer Egypt itself. That story waits for us in the chapters ahead. But for now, rest in the knowledge that human achievement takes many forms, that greatness can arise anywhere given the right combination of courage, wisdom, and determination. The people of Kerma proved that magnificent civilizations could flourish even in the harsh landscapes of the Upper Nile, that African kingdoms could stand as equals with any power in the ancient world. Let the whisper of desert winds carry you, now toward deeper rest, toward dreams of ancient cities and forgotten kings, toward the peaceful embrace of history's eternal rhythms. In the gentle darkness that embraces you now, as your body finds perfect stillness and your mind begins to drift toward peaceful dreams, let us witness one of history's most extraordinary reversals of fortune. Picture, if you will, the year 730 BCE, when the unthinkable became reality, when the ancient order of the Nile Valley turned upside down, and warriors from the south marched triumphantly into the very heart of Egyptian power. This is the story of how the conquered became conquerors, how a Nubian kingdom called Kush not only threw off centuries of Egyptian domination, but actually seized control of Egypt itself, ruling as legitimate pharaohs for nearly 100 years. As you rest here in comfort, breathing slowly and deeply, allow yourself to travel back to that pivotal moment when history held its breath and everything changed. The kingdom of Kush had emerged from the ashes of ancient Kerma, born in the region. Around the fourth cataract of the Nile, where the great river carved its way through some of the most dramatic landscape in all of Africa. Here, beneath the shadow of Jebel Barkal, a flat-topped mountain that rose like a natural pyramid from the desert floor, a new power had been quietly gathering strength for centuries. The early rulers of Kush were patient strategists who understood that true power required more than military might alone. While Egyptian dynasties rose and fell in the north, weakened by internal conflicts and foreign invasions, the Kushite kings built their strength methodically, creating a kingdom that was both thoroughly African and deeply influenced by the best of Egyptian civilization. Jebel Barkal became their sacred mountain, the dwelling place of the god Amun, whom they worshipped with a devotion that surpassed even that of the Egyptians themselves. At the mountain's base, they built the city of Napata, a magnificent capital that combined Nubian architectural traditions with the grandest elements of Egyptian temple design. Here, in chambers carved deep into the living rock, priests conducted rituals that they believed gave their kings not just the right to rule Nubia, but legitimate claim to the throne of Egypt as well. The man who would make this incredible claim a reality was named Pi, though history would remember him by the throne name Pianki. As you let your breathing become even more relaxed and regular, picture this remarkable ruler in his prime, a tall, powerfully built man with a dark skin and proud bearing that marked him as pure Nubian royalty. He wore his hair in the traditional style of his people, adorned with golden ornaments that caught the light as he moved, and around his neck hung amulets that proclaimed his devotion to Amun of Napata. Pi was no mere warlord seeking conquest for its own sake. He was a deeply religious man who genuinely believed that the gods had chosen him to restore proper worship and righteous rule to the land of the Pharaohs. Egyptian religion and culture had become corrupt in his view, diluted by foreign influences and weakened by the competing claims of multiple rulers, who divided the kingdom among themselves. The Egypt that Pi looked upon from his palace at Napata was indeed a shadow of its former glory. The once mighty kingdom had fragmented into competing dynasties, with different pharaohs ruling simultaneously in different regions. In the Delta, Libyan dynasties held sway, their rulers more concerned with personal wealth than with maintaining the ancient traditions. In the south, local princes governed as petty kings, paying lip service to pharaonic authority while pursuing their own interests. It was into this chaos that Pi marched in 730 BCE, leading an army that combined the finest traditions of Nubian warfare with tactical innovations learned from centuries of conflict. His soldiers were magnificent to behold, their dark skin oiled until it gleamed like polished bronze, their bodies adorned with the ritual scars and tattoos that marked them as veteran warriors. They carried the traditional bows of their ancestors, weapons so powerful that Egyptian chroniclers claimed a single Nubian archer could pierce armor at distances that seemed impossible. But Pi's army was more than a collection of tribal warriors. These were disciplined soldiers trained in the latest military techniques, equipped with iron weapons that were superior to anything their enemies could field, and organized into units that could maneuver with precision across varied terrain. More importantly, they fought with the conviction that they were carrying out a divine mission, restoring the proper order of the world under their rightful king. The conquest of Egypt unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated religious ceremony. City after city opened its gates to Pi's advancing army, their rulers recognizing in this Nubian king something they had not seen in generations, a pharaoh who truly embodied the ancient ideals of divine kingship. The priests of Amun, in particular, welcomed Pi as a liberator who would restore their temples to their former glory and cleanse Egyptian religion of foreign contamination. At Memphis, the ancient capital of unified Egypt, Pi demonstrated both his military prowess and his deep understanding of Egyptian religious traditions. Rather than simply besieging the city until it surrendered, he performed the elaborate rituals required of a legitimate pharaoh, purifying himself in the sacred lake, making offerings to the gods, and only then taking possession of the crown and royal regalia that had belonged to pharaohs for 3 millennia. The scene in Memphis on the day of Pi's coronation must have been one of the most remarkable in all of ancient history. Picture, as you rest in perfect tranquility, the great temple of Ptah, filled with Egyptian priests and Nubian nobles, all witnessing as a black-skinned king from the far south took his place on the throne of the pharaohs. The ancient ceremonies were performed with scrupulous attention to every detail, for Pi was determined to prove that he was not a foreign conqueror, but the rightful heir to a tradition that stretched back to the very beginning of Egyptian civilization. What followed was not the typical aftermath of military conquest, but something far more extraordinary. Pi and his successors ruled Egypt not as occupying forces, but as legitimate pharaohs, maintaining and even strengthening the ancient traditions that had made Egyptian civilization great. They restored temples that had fallen into ruin, revived religious festivals that had been neglected, and patronized arts and learning with a generosity that recalled the greatest periods of pharaonic history. The 25th dynasty, as historians now call this period of Nubian rule, produced some of the most beautiful art and architecture in all of Egyptian history. The Kushite pharaohs combined their own aesthetic traditions with classical Egyptian forms, creating a distinctive style that was both innovative and deeply respectful of ancient precedents. In their temples and tombs, we see images of black-skinned pharaohs wearing the traditional crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, their African features rendered with a dignity and power that proclaimed their legitimacy to all who saw them. Perhaps most remarkably, these Nubian rulers proved to be among the most effective pharaohs Egypt had known in centuries. Under their rule, the kingdom was reunified and strengthened, trade flourished, and Egypt once again became a major power in the ancient Near East. When the mighty Assyrian Empire threatened Egypt's independence, it was Kushite pharaohs who led the resistance, fighting with a courage and determination that earned the respect even of their enemies. The names of these remarkable rulers deserve to echo through history alongside those of the most famous pharaohs. Shabaka, who consolidated Kushite control over all of Egypt and initiated a massive program of temple restoration. Shebitku, who faced down the Assyrian threat with unwavering courage. And perhaps greatest of all, Taharka, whose 26-year reign represented the absolute pinnacle of Kushite achievement. A golden age when Egyptian civilization flourished under African leadership. Taharqa was everything a pharaoh should be: warrior and builder, patron of learning, and defender of tradition. His temples rose throughout the Nile Valley, from Nubia to the Delta, each one a masterpiece of architectural harmony that combined the best elements of both Egyptian and Nubian design. His armies marched as far as Palestine in defense of Egyptian interests, while his diplomats negotiated as equals with the greatest powers of the ancient world. As the gentle rhythms of sleep begin to call to you more insistently, let yourself picture Taharqa in his full pharaonic regalia, standing before the great temple of Amun at Karnak. He wears the double crown that symbolizes his rule over both Upper and Lower Egypt, the sacred Uriah serpent gleaming on his brow, the crook and flail of pharaonic authority crossed upon his chest. But look closely at his face, carved in stone by the finest sculptors of his age, and you will see features that are unmistakably African. A reminder that for nearly a century, Egypt was ruled by kings whose ancestors had hunted lions in the grasslands of Nubia and whose hearts remained true to the land of their birth. The achievement of the Kushite pharaohs was not merely military or political, but profoundly cultural and spiritual. They proved that greatness knows no boundaries of race or geography, that legitimate authority comes not from the accident of birth, but from the ability to embody the highest ideals of civilization itself. In their hands, the ancient traditions of Egypt not only survived, but flourished. Renewed by contact with the vibrant cultures of Africa's interior, that this golden age would not last forever. Eventually, the Assyrians would prove too strong even for these remarkable pharaohs, and the Kushite rulers would be forced to retreat southward to their ancestral homeland. But their legacy would endure, both in the monuments they left throughout the Nile Valley and in the proof they provided that African civilization could rise to heights that rivaled anything achieved anywhere in the ancient world. Tonight, as you drift toward dreams of ancient glory, remember these black pharaohs who wrote their names in the history of two great civilizations. Their whispers still echo in the desert wind, reminding us that true greatness transcends all boundaries, that the human spirit can triumph over any obstacle when guided by wisdom, courage, and an unshakable belief in justice. As your breathing deepens into the peaceful rhythm that carries you toward rest, let us journey to a place where the earthly and divine seem to meet in perfect harmony. Picture yourself standing at dawn in the shadow of Jebel Barkal, that magnificent, flat-topped mountain that rises like a natural pyramid from the Nubian desert, its reddish sandstone walls catching the first light of morning and glowing like burnished copper against the pale sky dot at the base of this sacred mountain. Spread along the life-giving waters of the Nile lay the city of Napata, the spiritual capital of the Kushite kingdom, and perhaps the most profoundly religious city in all of ancient Africa. Here, where the river curved in a great bend around the holy mountain, the rulers of Kush built not just a capital, but an earthly reflection of the divine realm itself, a place where mortal kings could commune directly with the gods who had chosen them to rule. The name Napata itself seems to whisper of sanctity and reverence. In the gentle darkness behind your closed eyes, imagine walking through this ancient city at the height of its glory, around 650 BCE, when Kushite pharaohs ruled both Egypt and Nubia from their twin capitals of Memphis and Napata. The morning air is cool and sweet, carrying the scent of acacia blossoms and the faint sound of temple bells calling the Allah faithful to prayer. The first thing that would strike any visitor to Napata was the extraordinary way the city's builders had integrated their architecture with the natural landscape. Rather than imposing their will upon the desert, they had worked with the rhythms of stone and sand, creating a harmony between human achievement and divine creation that was unlike anything else in the ancient world. The great temples seemed to grow from the base of Jebel Barkal itself, their pylons and courtyards following the natural contours of the mountainside. The Temple of Amun at Napata was the beating heart of this sacred city, a complex so vast and magnificent that it rivaled anything built by the greatest pharaohs of Egypt's golden age. But where Egyptian temples often proclaimed the power and glory of their royal builders, the Temple of Amun at Napata seemed designed primarily to honor the god himself, with architectural elements that directed the eye upward toward the peak of the holy mountain where Amun was believed to dwell. The approach to the temple was a carefully orchestrated, spiritual journey that began at the river's edge and climbed gradually toward the mountain's base. Pilgrims from throughout the Kushite kingdom would arrive by boat, their vessels laden with offerings of gold and frankincense, ivory and exotic woods from the far interior of Africa. As they disembarked at Napata's stone quays, they would see before them a processional way lined with ram-headed sphinx, their stone faces serene and eternal, guiding the faithful toward their divine destination. Each sphinx was a masterwork, of Kushite sculpture, combining the traditional Egyptian form with distinctively African aesthetic elements. The faces, while following classical pharaonic conventions, showed subtle differences in feature and expression that marked them as products of Nubian workshops. The ram's heads, sacred to Amun, were carved with an attention to naturalistic detail that reflected the Kushites' intimate knowledge of the animals that grazed in their homeland's grasslands. As you walked along this sacred avenue, the great pylon of the temple would gradually rise before you, its massive walls decorated with scenes that told the story of Kushite legitimacy in the language of traditional Egyptian religious art. Here, carved in eternal stone, Kushite kings made offerings to Amun, received the symbols of pharaonic authority from the god's own hands, and led their armies to victory under divine protection. But look closely at these reliefs, and you would notice something remarkable. While the artistic conventions were thoroughly Egyptian, the faces of the kings and queens were unmistakably African, their features rendered with a dignity and power that proclaimed their right to rule not despite their ethnicity, but because of the divine favor that transcended all earthly distinctions. These were not copies of Egyptian art, but something new and profoundly original, a visual theology that combined respect for ancient traditions with proud assertion of Kushite identity. The inner sanctum of the Temple of Amun was perhaps the most sacred space in all of Nubia, a chamber carved directly into the living rock of Jebel Barkal itself. Here, in darkness broken only by the flickering light of oil lamps, the high priests of Amun conducted rituals that were said to determine the very fate of kingdoms. The walls were covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions that recorded the god's commands, his choices for succession, his blessing upon royal undertakings. It was here, according to Kushite belief, that Amun himself selected each new king, speaking through oracles and divine signs that only the most learned priests could interpret. The process of royal selection was not merely political, but profoundly spiritual, a recognition that legitimate authority came not from human ambition, but from divine approval. This belief gave Kushite rulers a sense of religious legitimacy that their Egyptian subjects found compelling, helping to explain why Nubian rule was accepted so readily throughout the Nile Valley. The daily rhythms of life in Napata were structured around the temple's ceremonial calendar, with festivals and rituals marking the changing seasons and commemorating the great events of Kushite history. During the annual Opet festival, adapted from Egyptian tradition, but given distinctively Nubian elements, the entire city would participate in processions that carried the sacred bark of almond from the temple to special shrines throughout the urban area. These processions were spectacles of incredible beauty and religious fervor, with thousands of participants dressed in their finest clothing, carrying flowers and incense, singing hymns that echoed off the stone walls of Jebel Barkal. The king himself would lead these ceremonies, wearing the traditional pharaonic regalia, but also distinctively Kushite elements, including golden armbands and leg ornaments that reflected his people's aesthetic traditions. The priests of Amun at Napata were among the most learned men of their age, scholars who maintained libraries filled with papyrus scrolls containing religious texts, historical records, and works of literature from throughout the ancient world. They were the guardians not only of Kushite religious traditions, but of the broader intellectual heritage of the Nile Valley, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the turbulent centuries of foreign invasion and internal conflict. In the scriptoriums attached to the temple, scribes worked by lamplight to copy and preserve ancient texts, their reed pens moving across papyrus with the practiced precision of master craftsmen. Here, Egyptian hieroglyphic writing continued to flourish long after it had begun to decline in Egypt itself, maintained by Nubian scholars who saw themselves as the true heirs to pharaonic tradition. The royal palace at Napata was built according to principles that reflected the Kushite understanding of divine kingship. Rather than emphasizing the separation between ruler and subject, the palace was designed to facilitate the king's role as intermediary between the human and divine realms. Audience halls opened directly onto courtyards where citizens could petition their ruler, while private chambers provided spaces for the meditation and religious study that were considered essential to wise governance. The walls of the palace were decorated with murals that depicted not only royal achievements, but also scenes of daily life in the Kushite kingdom, showing the prosperity and cultural sophistication that flourished under enlightened rule. Farmers tended fields of sorghum and millet. Craftsmen worked at their benches, creating objects of extraordinary beauty. Traders from distant lands exchanged goods in bustling marketplaces. As the centuries passed and the center of Kushite power gradually shifted southward to Meroë, Nabata never lost its significance as the spiritual heart of the kingdom. Even when practical considerations required the royal court to relocate, Kushite rulers continued to journey north to Nabata for their coronations, recognizing that legitimacy could only be conferred by Amun of the Holy Mountain. The tombs of the Pata's rulers, carved into the cliffs near the city, reflect the deep religious convictions that guided Kushite civilization. These burial chambers were designed not merely as resting places for royal remains, but as eternal temples where the spirits of dead kings could continue to serve their people as intermediaries with the divine realm. The tomb walls were covered with religious texts that would guide the deceased through the challenges of the afterlife, ensuring their successful journey to the realm of the gods. As you rest now in perfect tranquility, your body growing heavier with each breath, let yourself picture Napata in its twilight glory, perhaps around 300 BCE, when the great age of Kushite power was drawing to a close. The sun sets behind Jebel Barkal, painting the sacred mountain in shades of gold and crimson, while the last light of day glints off the gilded pinnacles of the Temple of Amun. Somewhere in the temple's depths, priests continue the ancient rituals that have been performed. Here for 1,000 years, their voices rising in hymns of praise that seem to merge with the eternal silence of the desert. The sacred mountain stands guard over this holy city, as it has since the beginning of time, a reminder that some things transcend the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms. In Napata, the Kushites created something more lasting than mere political power. They built a bridge between heaven and earth, a place where the divine and human could meet in perfect harmony. Their whispers still echo in the chambers carved from living rock, reminding us that true greatness lies not in conquest or wealth, but in the ability to create spaces where the sacred can flourish in the midst of ordinary life. As the golden light of evening stretches across the Sudanese desert, casting long shadows between ancient stones, we find ourselves standing among monuments that have defied time itself. Here, scattered across the red sand like prayers carved in granite and sandstone, rise the forgotten pyramids of Nubia. More than 250 of them dot this landscape, their steep-sided silhouettes reaching toward the heavens with a grace that is both familiar and utterly unique. The wind whispers through the desert, carrying with it the scent of ancient stone warmed by countless sunrises. Each pyramid tells a story different from its Egyptian cousins to the north, yet born from the same human longing for immortality, for connection between earth and sky, between mortal kings and eternal gods. If you were to close your eyes and listen carefully, you might hear the distant echo of stone against stone, the patient rhythm of ancient builders who worked under this same vast sky nearly 3,000 years ago. These are the pyramids of Kush, monuments to rulers who dared to dream in stone, who chose to mark their eternal rest not with hidden tombs, but with bold declarations that pierce the desert horizon. Unlike the massive, broad-based pyramids of Giza, the Nubian pyramids rise with a different kind of majesty. They are smaller, yes, but their steep angles and narrow bases give them an almost ethereal quality. as if they are reaching upward with desperate urgency toward the stars. The tallest among them stands perhaps 100 feet high, while others rise a modest 20 or 30 feet. Yet each carries the same profound dignity, the same quiet insistence on permanence in an ever-changing world. The first of these remarkable monuments began to take shape around 750 BCE at El Kuru, a site that would become the first great necropolis of the Kushite kings. Here, south of the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, the early rulers of Nubia began a tradition that would span centuries and spread across 3 great burial grounds. El Kuru, with its pioneering pyramids, would be followed by the royal cemetery at Nuri, and finally by the grand necropolis at Meroë, where more than 40 kings and queens would find their final rest at El Kuru. We can trace the evolution of royal burial practices like reading the chapters of a stone book. The earliest tombs were simple tumuli, circular mounds of stone that protected subterranean burial chambers. But as the power and ambition of the Kushite rulers grew, so too did their monuments. King Pi, the great conqueror who would march north to claim the throne of Egypt itself, commissioned the first true pyramid at this site. His tomb marked a revolutionary change in building style, featuring a vaulted chamber that was both carved from living rock and constructed with carefully fitted stone masonry. The builders of these pyramids were master craftsmen who understood both the spiritual significance of their work and the practical challenges of construction in this harsh environment. They used the shaduf, a counterbalanced lever hoist that allowed them to lift massive blocks of granite and sandstone with surprising efficiency. The granite came from quarries along the Nile, its pink and gray surface perfectly suited to the desert setting, while the sandstone provided a softer medium for the intricate carvings that would adorn the pyramid walls. Each pyramid was built according to a sacred pattern that the Nubians had adapted from their Egyptian teachers, but made distinctly their own. The general construction followed precise spiritual requirements: steep walls that seemed to slice through the sky itself, a small chapel facing east toward the rising sun, and a stairway that also faced east, allowing the deceased ruler's soul to follow the path of Ire on his daily journey across the heavens. But perhaps the most remarkable difference between the Nubian pyramids and their Egyptian predecessors lay beneath the ground. While Egyptian pharaohs were traditionally buried within their pyramids, in elaborate chambers hidden deep inside the stone structure, the Nubian kings and queens rested in burial chambers carved directly into the bedrock beneath their monuments. The pyramid itself became a spiritual beacon, a marker and guardian of the sacred space below, rather than a container for the royal remains. This architectural choice reflects something profound about the Nubian understanding of death and the afterlife. The burial chamber, accessed through carefully constructed tunnels that opened at the base of the pyramid, was seen as a return to the earth itself, a reunion with the fundamental forces that had given life to the Nile Valley. The pyramid above served as an eternal prayer, a permanent offering to the gods, ensuring that the deceased ruler's journey to the afterlife would be blessed and protected. At Nuri, the second great royal cemetery, we find the tomb of King Taharqa, the Nubian pharaoh whose reign marked the height of Kushite power in Egypt. His pyramid, the oldest and largest at this site, demonstrates the full flowering of Nubian pyramid architecture. Built around 664 BCE, it rises with perfect geometric precision from a base of carefully fitted granite blocks, its steep sides creating sharp angles that seem to concentrate the desert light into brilliant focal points. The construction of Taharqa's pyramid required an extraordinary feat of engineering and logistics. Massive granite blocks, some weighing several tons, were transported from distant quarries and lifted into place using a combination of ramps, levers, and what appears to have been a sophisticated understanding of mechanical advantage. The burial chamber beneath, carved deep into the bedrock, was sealed with granite slabs of such enormous weight that some individual pieces required teams of dozens of workers to maneuver into position. But it is at Meroë where the Nubian pyramid tradition reached its most magnificent expression. Here, in a desert landscape that stretches endlessly toward the horizon, more than 40 royal pyramids create a forest of stone monuments that captures the imagination like few archaeological sites on Earth. The Pyramids of Meroë span nearly 1,000 years of construction, from the early period when Nubian rulers still closely followed Egyptian models to the later centuries when distinctly Meroitic styles began to emerge. Walking among the pyramids of Meroë today, one is struck by their remarkable variety. Some cluster together so closely that you could almost step from one pyramid base to another, creating intimate groups that suggest family burial plots where kings, queens, and their children rest near one another for eternity. Others stand in splendid isolation, their builders having chosen a prominent rise or commanding view that allows the monument to survey the entire landscape. The later pyramids at Meroë show clear signs of increasing Africanization, as the kingdom moved away from strict adherence to Egyptian models and began to incorporate more indigenous architectural elements. The Pyramid of Akhmeni, built around 200 BCE, represents this transition beautifully. While still fundamentally a pyramid in form, its decorative elements draw from African artistic traditions, featuring carved reliefs of elephants, giraffes, and gazelles that remind us that this desert was once a fertile grassland teeming with wildlife. The technical skill required to build these monuments in such a challenging environment cannot be overstated. The builders had to work in temperatures that could reach well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, using tools and techniques that required both physical strength and mathematical precision. The steep angles of the Nubian pyramids demanded careful calculation to ensure structural stability, while the decorative elements required artists capable of working in hard granite with tools that were primitive by modern standards. Each pyramid was also fitted with a small mortuary chapel, typically built against the eastern face of the monument. These chapels served as places where the living could come to make offerings and perform rituals for the deceased ruler. The walls of these chapels were often covered with intricate reliefs, depicting the journey of the dead king or queen through the afterlife, scenes of offering ceremonies, and images of the gods who would guide and protect the royal soul in its eternal existence. The burial process itself followed elaborate rituals that combined Egyptian practices with indigenous Nubian traditions. The deceased ruler was mummified, using techniques learned from Egyptian masters, but the grave goods and burial arrangements often reflected distinctly African customs. Gold jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship, weapons decorated with ivory and precious stones, and ceramic vessels containing food and drink for the afterlife journey were carefully arranged in the underground burial chambers. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Nubian pyramids is how they were grouped and organized across the landscape. Rather than being built as isolated monuments, they form complex clusters that seem to follow family relationships and dynastic succession. At Meroë, archaeologists have identified distinct groups of pyramids that appear to represent different royal lineages, each cluster maintaining its own character while contributing to the overall harmony of the necropolis. The smaller pyramids, often built for queens and royal children, display their own unique characteristics. Many feature more elaborate decorative programs than their larger counterparts, with carved reliefs that showcase the full range of Meroitic artistic achievement. The Pyramid of Queen Amenhotep, dating to the 1st century BCE, is particularly remarkable for its beautifully preserved reliefs depicting the queen in her royal regalia, making offerings to both Egyptian and Nubian deities. As we stand among these monuments in the gathering dusk, watching the last light of day transform the red sandstone into something that seems to glow from within, it becomes clear that the Nubian pyramids represent far more than mere imitations of Egyptian models. They are the expressions of a people who took inspiration from their northern neighbors, but never forgot their own identity, their own relationship with the land, their own understanding of what it means to build something that will outlast the lives of its creators. The clustering of these pyramids creates an almost city-like atmosphere, as if the dead kings and queens of Kush have created their own eternal settlement where they can continue to rule, to counsel one another, to watch over the living kingdom that they helped to build. In the silence of the desert night, when the only sounds are the whisper of wind through ancient stones and the distant call of desert creatures, it is easy to imagine these monuments as something more than mere tombs. They become presences, guardians, eternal witnesses to the greatness that once flourished in this seemingly empty land. Each pyramid tells its own story, not just through its size and grandeur, but through the countless details that speak of human hands, human dreams, human determination to create beauty, even in the face of mortality. The carefully smoothed surfaces that once gleamed in the desert sun, the precise angles that demonstrate mathematical understanding of the highest order, the decorative elements that show artistic traditions stretching back generations. All of these details combine to create monuments that are deeply, movingly human in their ambition and their achievement. The Nubian pyramids stand today as testimony to a truth that transcends any single culture or historical period, that human beings possess an irrepressible urge to create, to build, to leave behind something beautiful and permanent that will speak for them long after their voices have been silenced. In choosing the pyramid form, the rulers of Kush were not simply copying their Egyptian neighbors, but embracing a universal symbol of human aspiration, the desire to reach beyond the limitations of earthly existence and touch something eternal. As the stars begin to appear in the desert sky above these ancient monuments, we can feel the weight of all the centuries that have passed since the last stone was set in place, the last offering made, the last prayer spoken over these royal graves. Yet the pyramids endure, their sharp silhouettes still cutting clear lines against the horizon, still catching and holding the light, still inspiring wonder in all who encounter them. Tomorrow, when the sun rises once again over the red sands of Sudan, it will illuminate these same monuments that it has blessed with its light for nearly 3 millennia. The pyramids of Nubia will stand ready for another day, another century, another millennium of bearing witness to the enduring power of human creativity and the unquenchable desire to build something that will last beyond our brief stay in this world. In the soft hours before dawn, when the ancient city of Meroë stirs in the imagination like dust motes caught in the first rays of sunlight, we find ourselves witnessing one of history's most remarkable transformations. Here, along a bend in the Nile, where the river curves through what is now Sudan, a civilization chose to reinvent itself completely, creating something that was neither purely Egyptian nor entirely African, but a new synthesis that would flourish. For nearly 1,000 years, the transition from Napata to Meroë was not sudden, like the changing of seasons in the desert. Rather, it was a gradual shifting of power and identity that unfolded over generations, as natural and inevitable as the Nile's annual flood. By around 600 BCE, the political center of the Kushite kingdom had begun to migrate southward from Napata to this new capital, drawn by Meroë's more strategic location, its abundant natural resources, and perhaps most importantly, its distance from the growing threats that pressed upon Nubia from the north. Meroë occupied a position of extraordinary geographical advantage. Situated between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile, it controlled the river trade routes that connected Central Africa with Egypt and the Mediterranean world. But unlike Napata, which remained forever in Egypt's shadow both politically and culturally, Meroë sat far enough south to develop its own distinctive character, its own relationship with the African interior. its own understanding of what it meant to be both civilized and free. The land around Meroë was blessed with resources that would prove crucial to the kingdom's transformation. Rich deposits of iron ore lay scattered throughout the region, waiting for skilled hands to unlock their potential. Forests of acacia and other hardwood trees provided the charcoal needed for smelting, while the seasonal grasslands supported herds of cattle that would become both symbol and source of wealth for the Meroitic people. The river itself teemed with fish, and the annual floods deposited fertile silt that made agriculture possible even in this semi-arid landscape. But perhaps the most revolutionary change that marked Meroë's emergence as an independent power was its development of a unique writing system. Around 200 BCE, Meroitic scribes began using their own script rather than Egyptian hieroglyphs, creating an alphabetic writing system that would be used until about the 4th century CE. This was far more than a simple administrative convenience. The creation of Meroitic script represented a declaration of intellectual and cultural independence, a bold statement that this kingdom would no longer be content to express its thoughts and record its achievements in a foreign tongue. The Meroitic writing system was an abugida, where the vowel E was assumed when a consonant appeared alone, while other vowels were written explicitly. The script existed in two forms: hieroglyphic for monumental inscriptions carved in stone, and a cursive form written with a stylus on papyrus for everyday record-keeping. With 23 signs in total, this alphabetic script was used in over 1,278 known texts, though the language itself remains largely mysterious to modern scholars. Walking through the ruins of ancient Meroë today, one can still sense the revolutionary energy that must have filled this city during its period of transformation. The archaeological evidence speaks of a society that was consciously reimagining itself, deliberately choosing which elements of its Egyptian heritage to preserve and which aspects of African tradition to embrace. The result was a culture that felt both familiar and startling, rooted in ancient wisdom, yet boldly innovative in its expressions. The city itself was laid out according to principles that reflected this cultural synthesis. Egyptian-style temples stood alongside distinctly African architectural forms, their walls decorated with images that combined pharaonic imagery with representations of elephants, lions, and other creatures of the African savanna. The royal palaces incorporated building techniques learned from centuries of Egyptian contact, but their proportions and decorative schemes increasingly reflected local aesthetic preferences. But perhaps nothing symbolized Meroë's transformation more dramatically than its emergence as a center of iron production. Archaeological evidence suggests that advanced ironworking techniques were developed here, with the city earning the nickname the Birmingham of Africa for its extensive metallurgical activities. The Meroites developed blast furnaces fired by charcoal and operated with bellows, representing some of the earliest examples of advanced ironworking in sub-Saharan Africa. The mastery of iron technology gave Meroë tremendous advantages in both warfare and agriculture. Iron weapons made the Meroitic army a formidable force, capable of defending the kingdom's interests against enemies from all directions. Iron tools revolutionized farming, allowing for more efficient cultivation of the land and supporting a larger population. Iron also became a valuable trade commodity, exported throughout the region and contributing significantly to the kingdom's wealth. The process of iron smelting in ancient Meroë would have been a sight to behold. Iron smelting was the main industrial craft, providing farmers and hunters with superior tools and weapons that contributed to the kingdom's success, growth, and wealth. From the 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE, Kushite rulers controlled significant territory through their ability to ensure the production of significant quantities of iron. Imagine the workshop districts of ancient Meroë in the early morning, hours when the furnaces would be lit and the day's work begun. teams of skilled metalworkers. Their techniques, passed down through generations of master craftsmen, would tend the fires that transformed raw ore into the metal that shaped civilizations. The rhythmic sound of hammers against anvils would ring out across the city, mixing with the voices of merchants, the lowing of cattle, and the everyday sounds of a thriving urban center. The furnaces themselves were marvels of ancient engineering, carefully constructed to achieve the high temperatures necessary for efficient iron production. Built from clay and stone, and fired with charcoal that had been prepared from specific types of wood, these furnaces could reach temperatures of over 1,500 degrees Celsius. The process required not only technical skill, but also precise timing, as the smelters had to judge exactly when the ore had been properly reduced and the iron was ready to be worked. But Meroë's transformation involved much more than technological innovation. Perhaps even more revolutionary was the kingdom's evolving approach to gender and political power. Unlike most ancient societies, where women rarely held significant political authority, Meroë developed a system in which female rulers known as Candaces or Kandakes wielded real power and governed in their own right, rather than simply as regents for male heirs. The Candaces of Meroë were queens who ruled from the city c. 284 BCEC, 314 CE, with a number ruling independently c. 170 BCEC, 314 CE. This system represented a dramatic departure from traditional pharaonic models, where female rule was typically exceptional rather than normal. In Meroë, women's political authority became institutionalized, suggesting deep cultural roots that connected to broader African traditions of female leadership. The rise of powerful queens in Meroë reflected broader changes in the kingdom's social structure. Evidence suggests that Meroitic society may have incorporated matrilineal elements, where inheritance and family identity passed through the female line rather than the male. This would have given women not only political authority, but also economic power, as they would control the transmission of property and status from one generation to the next. These powerful women rulers were not merely figureheads or ceremonial monarchs. They led armies into battle, conducted diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers, and commissioned major building projects that demonstrated both their authority and their aesthetic vision. Their tombs, elaborate pyramid complexes that we explored in the previous chapter, stand as permanent testimonies to their real political power and their sophisticated understanding of royal propaganda. The artistic legacy of these queens reveals much about how Meroitic society understood female power. Relief carvings and sculptures show the Candaces in full royal regalia, carrying the traditional symbols of pharaonic authority, but often depicted with distinctly African physical features, and wearing jewelry and clothing that reflected local, rather than Egyptian tastes. These images project an aura of strength and confidence that speaks of rulers who are comfortable with their own authority and secure in their subjects' loyalty. As Meroë developed its own distinctive culture, it also became increasingly connected to the broader African continent. Trade routes that had once focused primarily on Egypt and the Mediterranean began to extend deep into sub-Saharan Africa, bringing exotic goods, new ideas, and diverse populations into contact with Meroitic civilization. Ivory from the south, gold from the western deserts, exotic animals, incense, and slaves all flowed through Meroë on their way to distant markets. This expansion of trade networks brought cultural exchange as well as economic benefit. Religious practices, artistic styles, technological innovations, and social customs spread along these trade routes, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere in Meroë that must have been remarkable for its time. The city became a meeting place where different African cultures encountered one another, sharing knowledge and creating new synthetic traditions that combined elements from across the continent. Religious life of Meroë reflected this cultural blending. While the kingdom maintained traditional Egyptian deities, like Amun and Isis. Local African gods and goddesses gained increasing prominence in the royal cult and popular worship. Lion gods that reflected the power and majesty of the African savanna appeared alongside crocodile deities that embodied the Nile's fertile power. Elephant symbolism, rare in Egyptian art but common in African tradition, became a frequent motif in Meroitic religious and royal imagery. This religious evolution reflected broader changes in how the Meroites understood their place in the world. Rather than seeing themselves as a peripheral extension of Egyptian civilization, they began to develop a sense of their own centrality, their own unique relationship with the divine forces that governed the universe. This spiritual independence complemented their political autonomy, creating a coherent worldview that justified their break with Northern tradition. The archaeological remains of Meroë tell the story of a society that was confident, prosperous, and culturally creative. Pottery workshops produced distinctive ceramics that combined Egyptian techniques with African decorative motifs. Textile production, evidenced by numerous spindle whorls and loom weights, created fabrics that clothed both local populations and distant customers who valued Meroitic craftsmanship. Jewelry workshops turned out ornaments of gold, silver, and bronze that demonstrated both technical skill and sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. But perhaps most impressive was the kingdom's approach to urban planning and architecture. Meroë was laid out as a carefully planned city, with distinct districts for different activities, wide streets that facilitated both commerce and ceremonial processions, and public buildings that demonstrated royal wealth and power. The great temple complexes, with their massive walls and elaborate decorative programs, created sacred spaces that were both intimately connected to Egyptian tradition and distinctly Meroitic in their execution, as evening settles over the ruins of ancient Meroë and the desert wind whispers through the broken walls and fallen columns. We can still feel something of the energy that once animated this remarkable place. Here was a civilization that chose transformation over stagnation, innovation over mere imitation, cultural synthesis over simple borrowing. The Kingdom of Meroë represents one of humanity's most successful experiments in conscious cultural evolution, a demonstration that societies need not be trapped by their histories, but can choose to become something new while honoring what came. Before in the quiet darkness that now surrounds these ancient stones, we might imagine the sounds that once filled these streets, the ring of hammers in the metalworking districts, the voices of traders negotiating deals in a dozen languages, the chanting of priests in temples dedicated to gods both old and new, the laughter of children playing in courtyards where their descendants would never walk. All of it speaks to the fundamental human capacity for reinvention, for the courage to become something different and better than what we have been. The transformation of Nubia into the Kingdom of Meroë reminds us that cultures, like individuals, have the power to choose their own destinies. In making that choice, the Meroites created something that was neither purely African nor purely Egyptian, but something entirely new, a civilization that would endure for nearly a millennium and leave traces that still inspire wonder in all who encounter them. In the pre-dawn stillness of ancient Meroë, when the palace corridors echoed with the soft footfall of servants preparing for another day, there lived women whose names would echo through history, not as consorts or mothers, but as rulers in their own right. These were the Kandakes, the warrior queens of Nubia, whose title meant more than simply queen. It signified a woman who held the power of life and death, who could command armies, negotiate with foreign powers, and shape the destiny of an entire civilization. The word Kandake, sometimes romanized as Candace by foreign chroniclers, was not merely a title of courtesy. It represented a unique institution in the ancient world, where women could ascend to the throne, not as temporary regents waiting for a male heir to come of age, but as sovereign rulers whose authority was absolute and whose legitimacy was never questioned. In a world where female political power was typically viewed with suspicion or outright hostility, the Kingdom of Kush created a space where women could rule as pharaohs, as generals, as the living embodiments of divine authority on earth. Tradition of the Kandake likely emerged from deeper African cultural patterns that recognized the spiritual and political authority of women, patterns that the Nubians maintained even as they adopted many Egyptian customs. This synthesis of African and Egyptian traditions created something entirely unique, a queenship that combined the pharaonic concept of divine kingship with indigenous African respect for female wisdom and power. Perhaps the most famous of these remarkable women was Kandake Amanirinas, whose reign began around 40 BCE, and whose confrontation with the Roman Empire would demonstrate that even the mightiest military power of the ancient world could not simply impose its will on a determined African queen. Strabo described her as a masculine sort of woman, and blind in one eye, but his words, intended perhaps as disparagement, instead capture something of the fierce determination that made her one of history's most formidable leaders. Amanirinas came to power during one of the most turbulent periods in Mediterranean history. She ruled during the reign of Cleopatra in Egypt and Mark Antony in Rome, until they were deposed in 30 BC by Augustus Caesar. When Augustus established Roman control over Egypt, the new province shared a border with Nubian territory, creating the conditions for a conflict that would test both empires. Resolve. The spark that ignited war came from Roman taxation policies and territorial ambitions. In 25 BC, Kandake Amanirinas attacked the city of Syene, today's Aswan, in territory of the Roman Empire. This was not a random act of aggression, but a carefully calculated strike designed to demonstrate that Nubia would not submit quietly to Roman expansion. Amanirinas herself led a Kushite military expedition of 30,000 men north to Egypt. The Nubian forces were formidable opponents, skilled in warfare tactics that the Romans had rarely encountered. The Egyptians had long called Kush the land of the bow, recognizing the exceptional archery skills of Nubian warriors. These were not merely individual fighters, but organized military units that could operate effectively in desert conditions that challenged even Roman logistics and discipline. During her campaigns against Rome, Amanirinas demonstrated both military prowess and psychological warfare that would have impressed any ancient general. The Kushite troops defaced many monuments to Caesar Augustus throughout the cities, with Amanirinas ordering the head removed from one bronze statue of Augustus, which she brought back to her palace and buried beneath the entrance as an insult to the emperor. This act was more than mere vandalism. It was a symbolic declaration that Roman power meant nothing in Nubian territory, that their emperor's image would literally be trampled underfoot by her subjects. The Roman response was swift and brutal. Emperor Augustus ordered a counterattack that reached deep into Nubian territory, even destroying the sacred city of Napata in retaliation. But Amanirinas and her forces proved remarkably resilient, adapting their tactics to the realities of fighting a technologically advanced enemy, while using their superior knowledge of local conditions to maintain the initiative. The conflict dragged on for years, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. The Romans found that their traditional tactics, so effective in Mediterranean warfare, were less successful in the harsh conditions of the Nubian desert. Meanwhile, Amanirinas demonstrated remarkable diplomatic as well as military skill, apparently negotiating directly with Roman commanders and maintaining the morale of her forces through multiple campaigns. After 3 years of battle, a peace treaty, highly favorable to the Nubians, was signed. Emperor Caesar Augustus agreed to take his army out of Egypt, give the Nubians back their land, and to cancel all taxes. This was an extraordinary outcome for any conflict with Rome during the imperial period. The fact that a small African kingdom could negotiate such favorable terms speaks volumes about both Amenarina's military capabilities and her diplomatic acumen. The treaty that ended the Roman-Nubian War established a precedent that would influence regional politics for centuries. It recognized Nubian sovereignty and created a buffer zone that protected the kingdom from further Roman expansion. More importantly, it demonstrated to the ancient world that Roman power, while formidable, was not limitless, and that skilled leadership could successfully resist even the mightiest empire. Following Amenarina's, the tradition of powerful Kandakes continued with equally remarkable women. Amanisha Kayo and Amanatar inherited her powerful legacy in protecting Lower Nubia from the Romans. Each brought her own distinctive approach to leadership while maintaining the essential characteristics that made the Kandake institution so unique. Kandake Amanisha Kaito, who reigned somewhere between 10 BC to 01 AD, is perhaps best known today for the extraordinary treasure that was discovered in her pyramid tomb. In 1834, Italian treasure hunter Giuseppe Folleni found a collection of jewelry in her pyramid, destroying the monument in his search for burial goods. While we must lament the destruction of irreplaceable archaeological evidence, the jewelry that survived provides remarkable insight into the wealth, artistic sophistication, and personal tastes of these royal women. The treasure contained 10 bracelets, 9 shield rings, 67 signet rings, 2 armbands, and an extraordinary number of loose amulets and necklaces, especially made for Queen Amanisha Kato by Nubian artists from her kingdom. These were not merely displays of wealth, but sophisticated works of art that combined traditional African motifs with Egyptian symbolic elements, creating jewelry that was distinctly Meroitic in style and meaning. The craftsmanship evident in Amanisha Kato's jewelry reveals much about the kingdom she ruled. The precision of the goldwork, the innovative use of colored glass and semi-precious stones, the sophisticated understanding of symbolic meaning embedded in each piece. All of this speaks to a society that valued artistic achievement and had the resources to support master craftsmen who could work at the highest levels of their art. But Amanisha Kato was far more than a wealthy collector of beautiful objects. She is depicted wearing the royal costume associated with the Nubian warrior and hunting gods, which further highlights her importance as a protector of her kingdom. Like her predecessors, she understood that queenship in Nubia meant military, as well as political leadership, that a Kandake must be prepared to lead her people in war as well as in peace. The artistic representations of these queens provide fascinating insights into how they understood their own authority and how they wanted to be remembered. Unlike many royal women from other ancient cultures, who are often depicted primarily in religious or domestic contexts, the Kandakes appear in art as active rulers engaged in the business of government and war. They wear the regalia of pharaonic authority. They carry the symbols of military command. They are shown making offerings to gods who would support them in battle and governance. Institution of the Kandake represented something revolutionary in the ancient world's understanding of gender and power. These were not women who ruled through their relationships to men, but queens whose authority derived from their own capabilities and their direct connection to the divine forces that legitimized royal power. They commanded armies, negotiated treaties, built monuments, and left legacies that influenced their kingdom's development for generations. The success of the Kandake system also suggests sophisticated approaches to education and preparation for leadership. These women clearly received training in military strategy, diplomacy, religious ritual, and administrative management. They understood economics, trade, and international relations well enough to navigate the complex political landscape of the ancient Mediterranean and African worlds. This level of preparation implies institutional support for female education and leadership, development that was remarkable for its time. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Kandakes were not isolated. examples of female power in Nubian society, but rather the pinnacle of a social system that provided women with considerably more authority and independence than was common in the ancient world. Meroitic art and inscriptions show women in various positions of responsibility, from priestesses to military officers to local administrators, suggesting that the kingdom maintained cultural patterns that recognized female capabilities across multiple levels of society. The religious dimensions of Kandake authority were also significant. These queens served as high priestesses in the cult of Amun and other deities, performing rituals that were essential to the kingdom's spiritual well-being. They built and maintained temples, commissioned religious art, and participated in ceremonies that linked the royal house to the divine order that governed the universe. This religious authority complemented their political power, creating a comprehensive model of leadership that integrated spiritual and temporal concerns. The legacy of the Kandakes extended far beyond their individual reigns. They established precedents for female leadership that influenced later African political traditions. They created artistic and architectural monuments that continue to inspire admiration, and they demonstrated strategic and tactical capabilities that earned respect from even their enemies. Most importantly, they proved that women could wield political power effectively in complex international environments, governing successfully through periods of war and peace, prosperity and challenge. As we reflect on these remarkable women, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the desert wind carries whispers of ancient voices across the sands of Sudan, we can still feel something of the strength and determination that animated their lives. The Kandakes were not mythical figures or legendary heroines, but real women who faced real challenges and achieved real victories through intelligence, courage, and unwavering commitment to their people's welfare that their pyramids still stand in. The Sudanese desert, weathered by centuries of wind and sand, but fundamentally intact, permanent testimonies to lives lived with purpose and power. In those monuments, in the jewelry and artifacts that survive from their reigns, in the written records left by friend and foe alike, we find evidence of women who refused to be limited by the expectations of their time, who created their own definitions of what it meant to be royal, to be powerful, to be remembered. The story of the Kandakes reminds us that history is full of remarkable individuals who shaped their world through force of personality and strength of will. These African queens stand alongside any rulers from the ancient world in terms of their achievements, their impact, and their enduring legacy. They governed wisely, fought bravely, and left behind a tradition of female leadership that deserves to be remembered and celebrated. In the growing light of dawn over the ancient kingdom of Kush, we can imagine these queens rising to face another day of challenges and opportunities, secure in their power, confident in their abilities, ready to defend their people and advance their civilization's interests. Their strength echoes still across the centuries, a reminder that leadership, courage, and wisdom are not limited by gender, race, or the prejudices of any particular age, but are qualities that can flourish wherever they are recognized, nurtured, and given the opportunity to grow. As the sun reaches its zenith over the bustling markets of ancient Meroë, we find ourselves standing at one of history's most remarkable crossroads. Here, where the blue and white Nile converge in their eternal dance toward the Mediterranean, something extraordinary unfolds before our dreaming eyes. Nubia, this golden kingdom of the southern reaches, has become far more than a mere neighbor to Egypt. It has transformed itself into the beating heart of Africa's greatest trading empire, a bridge between worlds that scholars today are only beginning to fully understand. Close your eyes and let yourself drift backward through the centuries, to a time when the morning air along the Nile carried not just the song of birds and the gentle lapping of water, but the melodic voices of merchants from lands both near and impossibly distant. Picture, if you will, a caravan approaching thee. walls of Meroë just as the first light of dawn touches the sandstone temples. The merchants have traveled for months, their camels laden with treasures that tell stories of civilizations you might never have imagined existed in such ancient times. From the heart of Africa, beyond the great cataracts where the Nile becomes wild and untamable, comes a procession that would have taken your breath away. The ivory tusks they carry gleam like moonlight made solid, each one representing not just the majesty of elephants that roam the vast savannas, but the skilled hands of artisans who would transform this precious material into objects of breathtaking beauty. These tusks will journey northward, eventually finding their way into the workshops of Egyptian craftsmen, or across the Mediterranean to Rome, where they will become intricate carvings that will survive millennia, still bearing the essence of Africa's wild heart. The ebony wood that follows in their train is so dark it seems to absorb light itself. Each piece carefully selected and aged, harder and more precious than gold to those who understand its worth. This wood will become the handles of ceremonial weapons, the frames of mirrors that will reflect the faces of queens, the delicate boxes that will hold the most precious possessions of households across the ancient world. But here, in this moment of quiet contemplation, it is simply wood that grew under African skies, cut by African hands, carried by African traders who understand its true value. And then there is the gold. Oh, the gold of Nubia, so abundant that it flows like water through the kingdom's economy. But this is not merely the raw yellow metal that gleams in riverbeds and hillside veins. The Nubian goldsmiths, inheritors of techniques passed down through generations, have transformed this earthborn treasure into works of art that rival anything created in the ancient world. Golden amulets shaped like scarab beetles, their surfaces engraved with prayers in the ancient Meroitic script that only the priests can fully read. Earrings that catch and hold sunlight like captured stars, meant to adorn the ears of princesses whose names echo still in the desert winds. Ceremonial daggers with handles of gold, so intricate that each spiral and curve seems to tell its own story of power and divine protection. As our imagined morning deepens and the market comes fully alive, notice how the air itself seems to shimmer, not just with heat, but with the mingling of languages. Here is a merchant from Egypt's Delta region, his white linen robes crisp despite the long journey south, speaking in the ancient tongue of the Pharaohs as he examines a bundle of ostrich feathers. These feathers, prized beyond measure for their perfect symmetry and ethereal lightness, will find their way into the headdresses of priests and the fans of nobility, each one a small piece of Africa's vast sky made tangible. Beside him stands a trader whose skin bears the deep tan of many seasons spent crossing the Sahara's endless expanse, his eyes bright with the particular intelligence of one who has learned to read the desert's moods as easily as you might read a familiar book. He carries with him bags of salt, crystalline white treasures that are literally worth their weight in gold in the lands beyond the desert's southern edge. For in those distant kingdoms, salt is not just a seasoning or a preservative, but the very foundation of life itself, the substance that allows food to be stored through lean seasons, that transforms simple meals into feasts worthy of kings, but perhaps most precious of all the goods that flow through. Nubia's markets are the spices and incense that arrive from lands so distant they exist more in legend than in any map. Frankincense, its resin tears caught from trees that grow in the mystery-shrouded kingdoms of Arabia, fills the air with a fragrance that seems to carry prayers directly to the ears of the gods. Myrrh, bitter and sweet at once, used in the most sacred of ceremonies, in the preparation of the dead for their eternal journeys, in the anointing of kings and the blessing of temples. These aromatics tell stories of trade routes that stretch across continents, of ships that brave the Red Sea's treacherous waters, of caravans that follow paths marked only by stars, and the ancient wisdom of guides who can find water where others see only endless sand. And here, in Nubia's markets, these treasures from the edge of the known world find their way into the hands of merchants who will carry them northward, spreading their fragrances through the temples of Memphis and Thebes across the Mediterranean, to Greece and Rome, creating connections that span half the world. The cultural exchange that flows along with these material goods is perhaps even more remarkable than the treasures themselves. In the workshops of Meroë's artisans, techniques learned from Egyptian masters blend with methods that have been perfected in the highlands of Ethiopia, creating pottery that is unlike anything produced elsewhere in the ancient world. The distinctive red and black ceramics of Nubian potters, with their bold geometric patterns and graceful forms, represent not just local tradition, but the synthesis of influences from across a continent. In the temples and palaces, we can observe something even more extraordinary taking place. The scribes of Nubia, trained in the hieroglyphic traditions of Egypt, have begun to adapt and transform these ancient symbols, creating their own unique script that historians now call Meroitic. This writing system, still only partially deciphered by modern scholars, represents nothing less than the birth of a distinctly African literary tradition, one that will record the deeds of kings and queens, the prayers of priests, the contracts of merchants, the love songs of poets whose names have been lost, but whose words still whisper from ancient stones. The religious traditions that flourish in this cosmopolitan environment show similar patterns of creative synthesis. The god Amun, beloved of the Egyptian pharaohs, finds new expression in Nubian temples, where his worship blends with older, indigenous traditions that reach back to the very beginnings of settled life along the Nile. The lion god Apednoc, unique to Nubian religion, emerges from this cultural fusion as a deity who embodies both the fierce, protective power of Egypt's gods and the deep spiritual connection to the African landscape that characterizes indigenous beliefs. But it is perhaps in the realm of metallurgy that Nubia's role as a cultural crossroads becomes most evident to modern archaeologists. The kingdom's ironworkers, building on techniques that may have originated in the highlands of eastern Africa, develop methods for smelting and forging that are remarkably advanced for their time. The iron tools and weapons produced in Nubian workshops are not merely functional items, but works of art in themselves, decorated with patterns that speak of aesthetic traditions shared across vast distances. These iron implements, along with the knowledge of how to create them, flow outward from Nubia in all directions, carrying with them not just superior technology, but new ways of thinking about the relationship between human skill and natural resources. A Nubian-made iron spear point, found by archaeologists in a grave hundreds of miles to the south, represents not just a tool or weapon, but a connection between communities that might never have interacted directly, bound together by the invisible. Threads of commerce and cultural exchange. The women of Nubia's trading families play roles that would seem remarkably modern to contemporary eyes. Unlike in many ancient societies, Nubian women actively participate in commercial ventures, sometimes leading trading expeditions of their own, managing complex networks of relationships that span continents. Their influence extends beyond mere commerce into the realms of diplomacy and cultural transmission, as marriages between noble families create bonds that facilitate trade while spreading artistic styles, religious practices, and technological innovations across vast distances. In the royal palaces of Meroë, we can observe how this constant cultural exchange manifests in the daily life of the elite. The queen's jewelry incorporates design elements from Egypt, Ethiopia, and the distant kingdoms beyond the Sahara, while her robes are woven from silk that may have originated as far away as ancient China, carried westward along trade routes that connected Africa to Asia in ways that still astonish historians. Her ceremonial crown bears ostrich feathers from the African interior, gold from Nubian mines, and precious stones that were carried northward from the mysterious lands beyond. The Great Desert, the music that fills the palace halls during evening entertainments, similarly reflects this cosmopolitan character. Traditional Nubian instruments, their forms perfected over centuries, blend their voices with harps, designed according to Egyptian principles, and drums whose rhythms echo patterns learned from traders who have ventured deep into the African continent. The songs themselves, composed in the Meroitic language, but influenced by melodies from across the known world, create a soundtrack to empire that is both distinctly Nubian and beautifully universal. Even the food served at royal banquets tell stories of cultural exchange and long-distance trade. Local fish from the Nile, prepared according to traditional methods that have been refined over generations, share the table with spices from Arabia, fruits that have been carefully preserved during long journeys from the Ethiopian highlands, and grain varieties that represent the agricultural innovations of multiple civilizations. Each meal becomes a celebration of Nubia's position at the crossroads of continents, a testament to the kingdom's ability to synthesize influences from across the ancient world into something uniquely its own. The scholars and priests who serve in Nubia's temples and schools similarly embody this synthesis of cultures. Trained in the mathematical and astronomical traditions of Egypt, they incorporate observational techniques learned from Arab traders and philosophical concepts that have traveled northward from the kingdoms of the African interior. Their calculations of the flooding of the Nile, their predictions of eclipses and other celestial events, and their understanding of medicine and natural philosophy represent the convergence of knowledge traditions from across half the world. In the temple schools where the children of nobles receive their education, young minds are exposed not just to the wisdom of their own ancestors, but to the accumulated knowledge of civilizations spanning continents. They learn to read and write not only in Meroitic, but in Egyptian hieroglyphs and possibly in the scripts of other trading partners. They study mathematics that incorporates insights from multiple traditions, astronomy that draws on observations made under different skies, and philosophy that reflects the synthesis of worldviews from across the ancient world. As the day winds toward evening and the last caravans of the day make their way through Meroë's gates, laden with goods that will continue their journeys northward with the morning light, we can begin to understand how Nubia's position as a trading crossroads transforms not just the material wealth of the kingdom, but its very soul. This constant flow of people, goods, and ideas creates a civilization that is both deeply rooted in its African heritage and remarkably cosmopolitan in its outlook. The children who play in the streets of Meroë grow up speaking multiple languages as naturally as they learn to walk. They hear stories that originated in lands they may never see, but which become part of their own cultural inheritance. They watch their parents negotiate with merchants from across the known world, learning not just the mechanics of commerce, but the arts of diplomacy, cultural sensitivity, and the delicate balance between maintaining one's own identity while remaining open to the wisdom of others. And as night falls over the kingdom, as the last merchants secure their goods and the palace musicians begin their evening concerts, as the priests prepare for the nighttime rituals that will ensure the gods' continued favor, we can sense how this daily rhythm of cultural exchange has created something unprecedented in the ancient world. Nubia has become more than just a kingdom or even an empire. It has become a crucible where the diverse streams of human civilization meet and mingle, creating new alloys of culture and consciousness that will influence the development of the entire region for centuries to come. The legacy of this cultural synthesis extends far beyond the political boundaries of the Kushite kingdom. The artistic styles developed in Nubian workshops influence the visual culture of Egypt to the north and Ethiopia to the east. The metallurgical techniques perfected by Nubian smiths spread throughout eastern Africa, revolutionizing agriculture, warfare, and craftsmanship across the continent. the diplomatic protocols developed to manage relationships with trading partners from diverse cultural backgrounds, create models for international relations that anticipate modern concepts of cultural exchange and mutual respect. Perhaps most remarkably, the religious and philosophical syntheses that emerge from this cultural crossroads contribute to the development of spiritual traditions that will endure for millennia. A Christianity that eventually takes root in Nubian soil is not simply an import from the Roman world, but a faith that has been enriched by its encounter with indigenous African spirituality and the cosmopolitan religious environment of the trading kingdom. Similarly, when Islam later arrives in the region, it finds fertile ground that has been prepared by centuries of cultural exchange and religious syncretism. As we prepare to drift from this vision of ancient Meroë as a thriving center of international commerce and cultural exchange, let yourself hold on to the image of the great marketplace at evening, when the day's business is done and the merchants gather around their fires to share meals and stories. In these moments of quiet fellowship, as representatives of dozen different cultures break bread together under the African stars, we can glimpse something that transcends the mere exchange of goods or even ideas. We see the fundamental human capacity for connection, for finding common ground across differences of language, custom, and belief. We witness the birth of true cosmopolitanism, not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived reality in the daily life of a kingdom that understood its destiny lay not in isolation, but in opening its arms to the wider world. And in this understanding, perhaps we can find a gentle lesson for our own time, a whisper from the ancient world that reminds us that the greatest civilizations have always been those that found strength not in exclusion, but in the rich complexity that comes from welcoming the stranger, learning from the foreigner, and discovering in cultural exchange not a threat to identity, but its ultimate enrichment. Rest now in this vision of ancient Nubia as the crossroads of continents, where the wisdom of the ages flowed like gold along the trade routes of the world, creating connections that still bind humanity together in ways we are only beginning to understand. Let the gentle murmur of ancient marketplaces and the soft whisper of desert winds carry you toward dreams of distant lands and timeless journeys, where every caravan brought not just treasure, but the precious gift of expanded horizons and deepened understanding. There comes a moment in every civilization's story when the very forces that once nurtured its greatness begin to shift, like a river slowly changing its course. For the golden kingdom of Meroë, this transformation began not with the clash of armies or the thunder of invasion, but with subtle changes that whispered through the land like evening breezes, carrying the scent of distant storms. Picture, if you will, a morning in the 4th century after Christ's birth, when the sun rises over Meroë's familiar silhouette of pyramids and palaces, temples and workshops. To the casual observer, little might seem changed from the glory days of centuries past. The market squares still bustle with activity, the Nile still flows northward with its eternal persistence, and the morning prayers still rise from temple courtyards like incense carried on the wind. Yet beneath this surface of continuity, something fundamental has begun to shift in ways that even the wisest advisors of the royal court cannot fully comprehend. The first whispers of change come from the land itself, from the very soil that has sustained Nubian civilization for more than a millennium. In the workshops where iron has been forged for generations, where the hammering of skilled smiths once rang from dawn to dusk, the work has become more difficult with each passing season. The great furnaces that once blazed so bright they could be seen from across the river now struggle to maintain their fierce temperatures, not for lack of skill among the metalworkers, but because the fuel that feeds them has become increasingly scarce. For centuries, the ironworkers of Meroë have drawn upon the forests once stretched along the riverbanks and into the hills beyond, harvesting the wood that transformed raw ore into the tools and weapons that made Nubian civilization possible. But success, paradoxically, has planted the seeds of its own limitation. Each generation of smiths, more skilled than the last, has consumed more fuel to meet the ever-growing demand for iron goods. The forests that once seemed inexhaustible have been steadily retreating, leaving behind landscapes of stumps and scrubland where mighty trees once stood. The consequences of this deforestation ripple outward through the ecosystem like stones, dropped in still water. Without the deep roots of great trees to anchor the soil, the seasonal rains that once nourished the land now carry away precious earth, leaving behind rocky ground that struggles to support even the hardiest vegetation. The annual floods of the Nile, once a blessing that renewed the fertility of the riverside fields, begin to deposit less of the rich silt that has sustained agriculture for millennia, as upstream watersheds lose their capacity to capture and hold the nutrients that flow toward the sea. In the agricultural districts that surround the great cities, farmers who have worked the same fields as their fathers and grandfathers before them begin to notice troubling changes. The soil that once yielded abundant harvests of grain seems somehow thinner, less responsive to familiar techniques of cultivation. Crops that once flourished begin to show signs of stress, their leaves yellowing despite adequate water, their roots struggling to find the nutrients they need in earth that has been worked continuously for centuries without sufficient rest or renewal. The overuse of the land becomes a slow spiral of declining productivity. Desperate to maintain their yields, farmers push their fields harder, planting season after season without allowing the soil the fallow periods it needs to recover. They expand cultivation into marginal lands, hillsides, and floodplains that their ancestors wisely left uncultivated, knowing that such areas are less stable and more prone to erosion. Each short-term solution creates longer-term problems, as the fundamental capacity of the land to support human civilization gradually erodes away. In the royal chambers, where the kingdom's advisors gather to discuss affairs of state, the economic implications of these environmental changes become increasingly difficult to ignore. The great iron industry that has been one of the pillars of Nubian wealth produces fewer tools and weapons with each passing year, not because demand has decreased, but because the cost of production has steadily risen as fuel becomes more expensive and difficult to obtain. The agricultural surplus that has traditionally supported the kingdom's urban population begins to shrink, forcing difficult choices about resource allocation and trade priorities. The trading networks that have long been the lifeblood of Nubian prosperity begin to shift as well, responding to changes that extend far beyond the kingdom's borders. To the east, a new power has been rising in the highlands of Ethiopia, the Kingdom of Aksum, whose merchants and warriors are increasingly assertive in their control over the trade routes that connect the African interior with the ports of the Red Sea. These Aksumite traders offer goods and services that compete directly with traditional Nubian products, while their strategic position gives them advantages that Meroë finds increasingly difficult to match. The rise of Aju represents more than simple commercial competition. It signals a fundamental shift in the political geography of northeastern Africa, as trade routes that have flowed through Nubian territory for centuries begin to be redirected through Aksumite-controlled paths. The gold, ivory, and exotic woods that have traditionally made their way northward through Meroë increasingly find more direct routes to Mediterranean markets through the Red Sea ports that Aksum controls, bypassing the Nile altogether. As these new trade patterns establish themselves, the tax revenues and commercial profits that have sustained the Meroitic court begin to decline. The great palaces and temples that have been maintained for generations require constant upkeep, but the resources to fund such maintenance become more scarce with each passing year. The royal workshops where artisans have created the magnificent pottery, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that are hallmarks of Nubian civilization find their markets, shrinking as foreign goods flood in to replace local products. In the temple complexes where the spiritual life of the kingdom centers, the priests begin to notice troubling omens that seem to reflect the earthly challenges facing their civilization. The annual inundation of the Nile, which has been tracked and predicted with remarkable accuracy for centuries, becomes more erratic and unpredictable. Some years bring floods that are too violent, washing away carefully tended fields and irrigation works. Others bring floods that are too weak, leaving vast areas of agricultural land without the water and silt renewal they need. The religious ceremonies that have long been performed to ensure the favor of the gods seem less effective in their traditional forms. The offerings of grain and livestock that once appeared abundantly in temple storehouses become more modest as agricultural productivity declines. The great festivals that have traditionally drawn pilgrims from across the kingdom and beyond attract smaller crowds as travel becomes more difficult and communities focus their resources on immediate survival rather than elaborate celebrations. The social fabric of the kingdom begins to show strain as well. In the urban centers, where craftsmen and merchants have long enjoyed prosperity that allows them to support extended families and maintain comfortable households, unemployment and underemployment become more common. Young people trained in traditional trades find fewer opportunities to practice their skills as demand for locally produced goods declines in favor of imports from more competitive regions. The royal court, once the center of a vibrant cultural life that attracted scholars, artists, and diplomats from across the known world, becomes more insular and defensive in its outlook. The confidence that has long characterized Nubian diplomacy gives way to a more cautious approach as the kingdom's relative power declines. Treaties and alliances that once favored Meroitic interests require more concessions and compromises as negotiating partners recognize the kingdom's weakened position. In the military sphere, the changes are perhaps most immediately visible. The iron weapons and tools that have long given Nubian forces advantages over their neighbors become more expensive to produce and maintain. The horses and camels that are essential for effective cavalry operations require fodder that becomes more costly as pastoral lands are converted to agriculture or simply degraded through overuse. The professional soldiers who have formed the backbone of the kingdom's defense forces find their pay reduced or delayed as royal revenues decline. The great construction projects that have long been symbols of royal power and divine favor begin to be scaled back or abandoned altogether. The pyramids and temples that previous generations built with confidence in their kingdom's eternal prosperity become harder to justify when resources are needed for more immediate concerns. The skilled architects and engineers who have maintained these monuments for generations find their expertise less in demand as priorities shift toward basic maintenance rather than ambitious new undertakings. There comes a moment in every civilization's story when the very forces that once nurtured its greatness begin to shift, like a river slowly changing its course. For the golden kingdom of Meroë, this transformation began not with the clash of armies or the thunder of invasion, but with subtle changes that whispered through the land like evening breezes, carrying the scent of distant storms. Picture, if you will, a morning in the 4th century after Christ's birth, when the sun rises over Meroë's familiar silhouette of pyramids and palaces, temples and workshops. To the casual observer, little might seem changed from the glory days of centuries past. The market squares still bustle with activity. The Nile still flows northward with its eternal persistence, and the morning prayers still rise from temple courtyards like incense carried on the wind. Yet beneath this surface of continuity, something fundamental has begun to shift in ways that even the wisest advisors of the royal court cannot fully comprehend. The first whispers of change come from the land itself, from the very soil that has sustained Nubian civilization for more than a millennium. In the workshops where iron has been forged for generations, where the hammering of skilled smiths once rang from dawn to dusk, the work has become more difficult with each passing season. The great furnaces that once blazed so bright they could be seen from across the river now struggle to maintain their fierce temperatures, not for lack of skill among the metalworkers, but because the fuel that feeds them has become increasingly scarce. For centuries, the ironworkers of Meroë have drawn upon the forests once stretched along the riverbanks and into the hills beyond, harvesting the wood that transformed raw ore into the tools and weapons that made Nubian civilization possible. But success, paradoxically, has planted the seeds of its own limitation. Each generation of smiths, more skilled than the last, has consumed more fuel to meet the ever-growing demand for iron goods. The forests that once seemed inexhaustible have been steadily retreating, leaving behind landscapes of stumps and scrubland where mighty trees once stood. The consequences of this deforestation ripple outward through the ecosystem like stones dropped in still water. Without the deep roots of great trees to anchor the soil, the seasonal rains that once nourished the land now carry away precious earth, leaving behind rocky ground that struggles to support even the hardiest vegetation. The annual floods of the Nile, once a blessing that renewed the fertility of the riverside fields, begin to deposit less of the rich silt that has sustained agriculture for millennia, as upstream watersheds lose their capacity to capture and hold the nutrients that flow toward the sea. In the agricultural districts that surround the great cities, farmers who have worked the same fields as their fathers and grandfathers before them begin to notice troubling changes. The soil that once yielded abundant harvests of grain seems somehow thinner, less responsive to familiar techniques of cultivation. Crops that once flourished begin to show signs of stress, their leaves yellowing despite adequate water, their roots struggling to find the nutrients they need in earth that has been worked continuously for centuries without sufficient rest or renewal. The overuse of the land becomes a slow spiral of declining productivity. Desperate to maintain their yields, farmers push their fields harder, planting season after season without allowing the soil the fallow periods it needs to recover. They expand cultivation into marginal lands, hillsides, and floodplains that their ancestors wisely left uncultivated, knowing that such areas are less stable and more prone to erosion. Each short-term solution creates longer-term problems, as the fundamental capacity of the land to support human civilization gradually erodes away. In the royal chambers, where the kingdom's advisors gather to discuss affairs of state, the economic implications of these environmental changes become increasingly difficult to ignore. The great iron industry that has been one of the pillars of Nubian wealth produces fewer tools and weapons with each passing year, not because demand has decreased, but because the cost of production has steadily risen as fuel becomes more expensive and difficult to obtain. The agricultural surplus that has traditionally supported the kingdom's urban population begins to shrink, forcing difficult choices about resource allocation and trade priorities. The trading networks that have long been the lifeblood of Nubian prosperity begin to shift as well, responding to changes that extend far beyond the kingdom's borders. To the east, a new power has been rising in the highlands of Ethiopia, the Kingdom of Aksum, whose merchants and warriors are increasingly assertive in their control over the trade routes that connect the African interior with the ports of the Red Sea. These Aksumite traders offer goods and services that compete directly with traditional Nubian products, while their strategic position gives them advantages that Meroë finds increasingly difficult to match. The rise of Aju represents more than simple commercial competition. It signals a fundamental shift in the political geography of northeastern Africa, as trade routes that have flowed through Nubian territory for centuries begin to be redirected through Aksumite-controlled paths. The gold, ivory, and exotic woods that have traditionally made their way northward through Meroë increasingly find more direct routes to Mediterranean markets through the Red Sea ports that Aksum controls, bypassing the Nile altogether. As these new trade patterns establish themselves, the tax revenues and commercial profits that have sustained the Meroitic court begin to decline. The great palaces and temples that have been maintained for generations require constant upkeep, but the resources to fund such maintenance become more scarce with each passing year. The royal workshops where artisans have created the magnificent pottery, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that are hallmarks of Nubian civilization find their markets, shrinking as foreign goods flood in to replace local products. In the temple complexes where the spiritual life of the kingdom centers, the priests begin to notice troubling omens that seem to reflect the earthly challenges facing their civilization. The annual inundation of the Nile, which has been tracked and predicted with remarkable accuracy for centuries, becomes more erratic and unpredictable. Some years bring floods that are too violent, washing away carefully tended fields and irrigation works. Others bring floods that are too weak, leaving vast areas of agricultural land without the water and silt renewal they need. The religious ceremonies that have long been performed to ensure the favor of the gods seem less effective in their traditional forms. The offerings of grain and livestock that once appeared abundantly in temple storehouses become more modest as agricultural productivity declines. The great festivals that have traditionally drawn pilgrims from across the kingdom and beyond attract smaller crowds as travel becomes more difficult and communities focus their resources on immediate survival rather than elaborate celebrations. The social fabric of the kingdom begins to show strain as well. In the urban centers, where craftsmen and merchants have long enjoyed prosperity that allows them to support extended families and maintain comfortable households, unemployment and underemployment become more common. Young people trained in traditional trades find fewer opportunities to practice their skills as demand for locally produced goods declines in favor of imports from more competitive regions. The royal court, once the center of a vibrant cultural life that attracted scholars, artists, and diplomats from across the known world, becomes more insular and defensive in its outlook. The confidence that has long characterized Nubian diplomacy gives way to a more cautious approach as the kingdom's relative power declines. Treaties and alliances that once favored Meroitic interests require more concessions and compromises as negotiating partners recognize the kingdom's weakened position. In the military sphere, the changes are perhaps most immediately visible. The iron weapons and tools that have long given Nubian forces advantages over their neighbors become more expensive to produce and maintain. The horses and camels that are essential for effective cavalry operations require fodder that becomes more costly as pastoral lands are converted to agriculture or simply degraded through overuse. The professional soldiers who have formed the backbone of the kingdom's defense forces find their pay reduced or delayed as royal revenues decline. The great construction projects that have long been symbols of royal power and divine favor begin to be scaled back or abandoned altogether. The pyramids and temples that previous generations built with confidence in their kingdom's eternal prosperity become harder to justify when resources are needed for more immediate concerns. The skilled architects and engineers who have maintained these monuments for generations find their expertise less in demand as priorities shift toward basic maintenance rather than ambitious new undertakings. Yet even as these challenges mount, the essential character of Nubian civilization persists with remarkable resilience. The scholars who preserve the kingdom's written traditions continue their work, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining the intellectual legacy that has been built over centuries. The Meroitic script, which has recorded the deeds of kings and queens, the prayers of priests, and the contracts of merchants, continues to evolve and develop even as the political power it serves declines. The artistic traditions that have flourished under royal patronage, find new expressions in more modest forms. Potters who once created elaborate ceremonial vessels adapt their skills to produce simpler but still beautiful everyday items. Jewelers who once worked with abundant supplies of gold learn to create elegant pieces with more limited materials. Musicians and poets, perhaps most portable of all the arts, continue to create works that capture the enduring spirit of their culture, even as its external circumstances change. In the countryside, where the vast majority of the population has always lived, traditional ways of life adapt gradually to new realities. Farmers experiment with different crops and cultivation techniques, seeking varieties that can thrive in the changing conditions. Herders adjust their migration patterns to account for new grazing conditions and water sources. Communities develop new forms of cooperation and mutual support to help members cope with increasing uncertainty. The religious life of the kingdom also shows remarkable adaptability to changing circumstances. While the great temple ceremonies may be less elaborate than in previous generations, the fundamental spiritual practices that connect communities to their ancestors and their land continue to provide meaning and comfort. New forms of worship emerge that are less dependent on costly offerings and more focused on personal devotion and community solidarity. As the 4th century progresses, the kingdom faces its greatest external challenge when the armies of Aksum launch a decisive invasion around 350 CE, ultimately destroying Meroë and forcing its abandonment. But this final military defeat, traumatic as it may be, represents less the sudden collapse of a healthy civilization than the culmination of longer processes of environmental and economic decline that have been weakening the kingdom's foundations. For generations, the invasion itself, when it comes, unfolds with the inexorable quality of a natural disaster long anticipated. The Aksumite forces, strengthened by their control of lucrative Red Sea trade routes and equipped with weapons forged from iron that may have originally been smelted in Nubian furnaces, advance northward along traditional invasion routes that have been traveled by armies for millennia. The defenders of Meroë, weakened by decades of declining resources and reduced military capacity, mount what resistance they can, but the outcome has perhaps been determined by forces set in motion long before the first Aksumite warrior crosses the border. The sack of Meroë, when it comes, represents the end of more than 1,000 years of continuous Nubian rule along this stretch of the Nile. The great palaces are burned or abandoned, their treasuries emptied, their libraries scattered. The temples that have been centers of learning and worship for generations fall silent, their priests fled or killed, their sacred fires extinguished. The workshops where artisans have practiced their crafts for centuries are ransacked or destroyed, their tools and techniques lost or carried away by conquerors, who may not fully understand what they have captured. Yet even in this moment of apparent ending, the deeper currents of Nubian civilization continue to flow. The survivors of the conquest carry with them not just their lives, but their memories, their skills, their stories, and their dreams. Some flee southward into regions that remain beyond Aksumite control, where they establish new communities that preserve elements of their ancestral culture. Others adapt to the new political realities, finding ways to maintain their traditions within the framework of foreign rule. The knowledge accumulated over centuries of scholarship does not simply vanish with the burning of palaces and temples. It lives on in the minds of those who have mastered it, in the oral traditions that supplement written records, in the practical skills that are passed from master to apprentice, regardless of political upheavals. The artistic techniques perfected by generations of Nubian craftsmen continue to influence the development of regional cultures, long after the kingdom that nurtured them has fallen. As night settles over the ruins of what was once the greatest city between the Mediterranean and the heart of Africa, as the last fires die down and silence reclaims the courtyards where the voices of kings and merchants once echoed, we might pause to reflect on the profound lessons embedded in this story. of decline and fall. The fate of Meroë reminds us that even the most successful civilizations remain vulnerable to the consequences of their own success, that the very activities that create prosperity can, if pursued without sufficient attention to their long-term sustainability, ultimately undermine the foundations upon which that prosperity rests. The environmental degradation that contributes to Nubia's decline speaks to universal human challenges that transcend any particular time or place. The tension between immediate needs and long-term sustainability, between the demands of growing populations and the finite capacity of natural systems, between the pursuit of wealth and the preservation of the resources that make wealth possible. These are dilemmas that every civilization must confront in its own way. Yet the story of Nubian decline is not simply a tale of environmental determinism or inevitable collapse. It is also a story of human choices, of roads taken and not taken, of opportunities seized and missed. At many points along the way, different decisions might have led to different outcomes. More sustainable practices in iron production and agriculture, more flexible responses to changing trade patterns, more effective adaptation to new political realities. All these might have allowed the kingdom to weather the storms that ultimately overwhelmed it. Perhaps most importantly, the end of Meroë, as a political entity, does not represent the end of Nubian civilization in any complete sense. The cultural achievements of the kingdom, its artistic traditions, its technological innovations, its social institutions, its spiritual insights, all these continue to live and evolve in new forms. The people themselves survive, carrying their heritage into new contexts where it continues to enrich human experience in ways that may be less visible, but no less real than the monuments they once built. As we prepare to move forward in our gentle journey through time, let us carry with us not just the sadness of endings, but the recognition that every ending contains within it the seeds of new beginnings. The decline of one form of civilization creates space for others to emerge, each building upon the foundations laid by its predecessors, each adding its own unique contributions to the ongoing human story. In the quiet darkness that now settles over the ancient land, in the whisper of wind through empty palaces and silent temples, we can hear not just the echoes of what has been lost, but the faint stirrings of what is yet to come. For the river continues to flow, carrying its waters and its memories toward distant seas, and along its banks new communities will arise, new stories will unfold, new dreams will take shape under the same eternal stars that once watched over the glory of Nubia. In the soft light of early morning, when the desert air carries the coolness of night and the promise of day, a visitor to the modern lands of Egypt and Sudan might pause along the banks of the Nile and listen carefully to what the river has to say. For those who know how to hear, the waters still carry stories from the ancient kingdoms, tales that flow northward as they have for thousands of years, carrying with them the enduring legacy of a civilization that, though it fell from political power centuries ago, has never truly disappeared from the world. The most visible testament to Nubia's lasting presence stands carved in stone, rising from landscapes that bridge the modern border between Egypt and Sudan. The monuments that Nubian rulers built, temples, palaces, and royal pyramids, still stand at sites throughout both countries, bearing witness to the architectural mastery and artistic vision of their creators. These are not merely ancient ruins, frozen relics of a dead past, but living monuments that continue to speak to visitors from around the world, their hieroglyphs and reliefs telling stories that remain as compelling today as when they were first carved. The great temple of Abu Simbel, though built by Egyptian pharaohs, stands as a monument to the complex relationship between Egypt and Nubia that shaped both civilizations for millennia. When rising waters from the Aswan Dam threatened to submerge these monuments forever, an international rescue effort dismantled and relocated the temples, cutting them into more than 2,000 blocks, weighing 10 to 40 tons each, and rebuilding them. 65 meters above their original location. This extraordinary effort, which cost $40 million and captured the imagination of the world, demonstrates how deeply the legacy of this region continues to matter to humanity as a whole. But the preservation of Abu Simbel represents more than just the saving of ancient stones. It symbolizes a growing recognition of Nubia's fundamental importance to human civilization, an acknowledgement that for too long had been obscured by historical narratives that relegated African achievements to the margins of world history. Modern scientists are now racing to document what remains of the ancient African civilization, recognizing how it was long ignored by earlier scholars as a mere footnote to Egyptian history. In the museums and archaeological sites of modern Egypt and Sudan, this process of rediscovery continues to unfold. Scholars trained in the latest techniques of archaeological investigation work alongside local communities to uncover new evidence of Nubian achievement, each season bringing fresh insights into the sophistication and creativity of these ancient civilizations. The pottery sherds and jewelry fragments, the temple foundations and burial chambers that emerge from careful excavation tell stories that challenge and expand our understanding of early human societies. The influence of Nubian civilization extends far beyond the preservation of its monuments. In the artistic traditions of the region, we can trace continuous threads that connect ancient practices to contemporary expression. The Nubian languages that are still spoken today, including Nubian, Dongolawi, and Midab, represent direct linguistic descendants of the tongues spoken in the ancient kingdoms. These languages carry within their vocabulary and grammar structures the accumulated wisdom of generations, preserving ways of understanding the world that have their roots in the deepest antiquity. The traditional crafts practiced in Nubian communities today often employ techniques that would be recognizable to artisans from the time of the Pharaohs. The methods of agriculture, fishing, and water management, including the use of traditional irrigation devices like the shaduf and shakia, represent essentially unchanged practices that have been refined over thousands of years. In these continuities, we glimpse something remarkable: the persistence of human knowledge and skill across vast spans of time, the way that practical wisdom adapts to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. In the social structures of contemporary Nubian communities, anthropologists have noted patterns that echo ancient traditions. Among less Arabized Nubian groups, women traditionally maintain positions of greater influence than in many surrounding societies, perhaps reflecting the legacy of the powerful Kandake queens who once ruled the Kingdom of Meroë. These patterns of social organization, transmitted through generations of oral tradition and cultural practice, represent one of the most intimate ways in which the ancient past continues to shape the living present. The architectural traditions of the region similarly show remarkable continuity with ancient practices. In the traditional Nubian villages that line the Nile, the distinctive domed houses with their thick mud brick walls and carefully designed courtyards represent refinements of building techniques that have been developed over millennia. These structures, perfectly adapted to the harsh climate of the region, demonstrate the accumulated wisdom of generations of builders who understood how to create comfortable, durable homes using locally available materials. The influence of Nubian civilization can also be traced in the broader patterns of African cultural development. The ironworking techniques that were perfected in the workshops of Meroë spread throughout Eastern Africa, contributing to technological developments that transformed societies across the continent. The artistic styles created by Nubian craftsmen influenced the visual culture of neighboring regions. Their geometric patterns and symbolic motifs appearing in textiles, pottery, and metalwork produced far from the original centers of innovation. In the realm of scholarship, the rediscovery of Nubian achievements has contributed to a fundamental rewriting of African history. Where earlier generations of historians saw primarily Egyptian influence flowing southward, contemporary researchers recognize the complex, bidirectional exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that characterize the relationship between Egypt and its southern neighbors. This recognition has implications that extend far beyond academic debates, contributing to a more accurate and dignified understanding of Africa's role in human development. The decipherment of the Meroitic script, though still incomplete, has opened new windows into the intellectual life of ancient Nubia. As scholars gradually unlock the meanings encoded in these inscriptions, they reveal a literate society with its own traditions of record-keeping, poetry, and religious expression. Each newly translated text adds to our understanding of how the Nubians saw themselves and their world, their hopes and fears, their relationships with gods and ancestors, their understanding of justice and beauty, the religious legacy of Nubian civilization presents another fascinating area of continuity and transformation. When Christianity arrived in the region during the 6th century, it did not simply replace earlier beliefs, but blended with existing spiritual traditions to create distinctive forms of African Christianity that flourished for nearly 1,000 years. The painted churches and monasteries of medieval Nubia, many now being carefully restored and studied, represent one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of Christian art, their frescoes and architectural details reflecting the synthesis of Mediterranean Christian traditions with indigenous African spiritual practices. Similarly, when Islam later became the dominant religion of the region, it too was influenced by the spiritual landscape it encountered. The forms of Islamic practice that developed in Nubia and Sudan often incorporated elements that can be traced to much older traditions, creating distinctive regional variants of Islamic culture that remain characteristic of the area today. The economic patterns that characterize modern Sudan and southern Egypt also show the lasting influence of ancient trade networks. The communities that line the Nile today continue to serve as intermediaries between different regions, their strategic position along the river maintaining advantages that have been exploited for millennia. The skills and knowledge required for successful trade across cultural and linguistic boundaries, refined over centuries of practice, continue to be valuable assets in contemporary economic life. The archaeological heritage of Nubia has become an increasingly important economic resource in its own right. Tourism to the region, driven by growing international interest in African civilizations, brings visitors from around the world to see the monuments and museums that preserve Nubian achievements. This tourism not only provides economic opportunities for local communities, but also creates incentives for the continued preservation and study of the archaeological heritage. The influence of Nubian civilization on contemporary art and literature extends far beyond the boundaries of Sudan and Egypt. Artists and writers from across Africa and the African diaspora have drawn inspiration from the example of the Black Pharaohs, finding in their achievements powerful symbols of African capability and dignity. The rediscovery of Nubian history has contributed to broader movements for the recognition of African contributions to world civilization, challenging narratives that have traditionally marginalized African achievements. In the field of archaeology itself, the study of Nubian sites has contributed to methodological innovations that have influenced the discipline worldwide. The challenges of working in harsh desert conditions, of preserving monuments threatened by development and environmental change, of collaborating with local communities to ensure that archaeological work serves their interests as well as those of international scholarship. All these have pushed archaeologists to develop new approaches that are now applied in research around the world. The genetic legacy of ancient Nubia, as revealed by ongoing studies of human remains and modern populations, tells another part of the story of continuity and change. While modern populations in the region show evidence of mixing with other groups over the centuries, genetic markers that can be traced to ancient Nubian populations persist in contemporary communities, representing biological as well as cultural continuity across the millennia. The environmental challenges that face the Nile Valley today also reflect patterns that can be traced to ancient times. The management of water resources, the balance between agricultural needs and ecosystem preservation, the adaptation to climate variability. These are issues that the ancient Nubians faced in their own time and that their modern successors continue to confront. The traditional ecological knowledge that has been developed over millennia of life along the Nile represents a valuable resource for addressing contemporary environmental challenges. The political legacy of Nubian civilization can be seen in the continued importance of the cultural and ethnic identities that trace their origins to the ancient kingdoms. Today, the region of Nubia is split between Egypt and Sudan, but Nubian peoples maintain cultural connections that transcend these modern political boundaries. The struggle for recognition of Nubian rights and cultural autonomy in both countries reflects the persistence of identities that have their roots in the ancient past. The educational initiatives that seek to preserve and transmit Nubian cultural knowledge represent one of the most important aspects of the contemporary legacy. In schools and community centers throughout the region, efforts are underway to ensure that young people learn about their cultural heritage, that traditional languages continue to be spoken, that ancient crafts and customs are passed on to new generations. These educational efforts, often supported by international organizations and diaspora communities, represent a form of cultural resistance to the homogenizing pressures of globalization. The digital preservation of Nubian heritage has become another important frontier in the effort to ensure that this legacy survives for future generations. High-resolution photography and three-dimensional modeling of monuments and artifacts, digital archives of manuscripts and inscriptions, online databases of archaeological findings, all these technologies are being deployed to create permanent records of Nubian achievements that will remain accessible even if the original materials are lost to time or human conflict. The scholarly conferences and publications that focus on Nubian studies represent another dimension of the civilization's contemporary legacy. Nubiology, the archaeological science dealing with ancient Nubia, has become a recognized academic specialty with its own professional organizations, specialized journals, and dedicated research institutions. This academic infrastructure ensures that the study of Nubian civilization continues to advance, that new discoveries are properly analyzed and published, that the knowledge gained from archaeological research is made available to both scholarly and popular audiences. In the realm of international relations, a heritage of ancient Nubia serves as a source of pride and diplomatic soft power for the modern nations that encompass its former territory. Cultural exchanges based on shared Nubian heritage create connections between communities in different countries, while the international recognition of Nubian achievements enhances the cultural prestige of Egypt and Sudan on the world stage. As we approach the end of our gentle journey through time, standing once again beside the eternal Nile as it flows northward, carrying its ancient memories toward the Mediterranean, we can begin to appreciate the full measure of Nubia's enduring legacy. This is not simply the story of a dead civilization preserved in museums and archaeological sites, but of a living heritage that continues to shape human experience in countless ways. The achievements of the ancient Nubians, their artistic creations, their technological innovations, their social institutions, their spiritual insights, all these continue to enrich human culture in forms that are sometimes visible and sometimes hidden, but always present. In the languages still spoken along the Nile, in the crafts still practiced in traditional workshops, in the agricultural techniques still employed in riverside villages, in the architectural forms still preferred for desert construction, the wisdom of the ancient kingdoms persists. More broadly, the example of Nubian civilization serves as a powerful reminder of Africa's central role in human development. Far from being a peripheral continent that merely received influences from elsewhere, Africa emerges from the Nubian story as a creative center that contributed fundamental innovations to world civilization. The iron technology, the artistic traditions, the political institutions, the religious concepts that developed in the Nile Valley helped to shape the broader patterns of human cultural development. The legacy of the Black Pharaohs, in particular, continues to inspire people around the world who find in their achievements powerful symbols of African capability and dignity. These rulers, who successfully governed one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations, who built monuments that still stand after 2.5 millennia, who created works of art that still move viewers with their beauty and power, represent living proof of what African societies have contributed to human heritage. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Nubian civilization reminds us that human achievement transcends the boundaries of race, ethnicity, and geography that too often divide us. The ancient Nubians, drawing on traditions from across Africa and beyond, created something new and beautiful that enriched not just their own lives, but the entire human inheritance. Their example suggests that our greatest achievements as a species come not from isolation and exclusion, but from the creative mixing of influences, the generous sharing of knowledge, the patient building of connections across different as the last light of evening fades over the ancient land, and the stars begin to appear in the clear desert sky, as the Nile continues its eternal journey toward the sea, and the monuments of the Pharaohs settle into the quiet of night, we can rest in the knowledge that the whispers of Nubian civilization will continue to echo through time. In the voices of children learning traditional songs, in the hands of artisans practicing ancient crafts, in the dreams of scholars uncovering new truths about the past, in the hopes of communities working to preserve their heritage for future generations, the spirit of ancient Nubia lives on. The kingdoms may have fallen, the pyramids may be weathered by centuries of wind and sand, the palaces may lie in ruins, but the essential legacy endures. In every act of cultural preservation, in every effort to recover lost knowledge, in every recognition of Africa's contributions to human civilization, in every celebration of the dignity and achievement of all peoples, the dreams of the ancient Nubians find new expression. And so our journey ends where it began, with the gentle sound of the Nile flowing northward through the desert night, carrying its ancient memories toward distant shores. But the river's song has been enriched by our passage through time, and in its whispers we can now hear not just the voices of the past, but the promise of discoveries yet to come, of knowledge yet to be recovered, of connections yet to be made, between the world that was and the world that is still unfolding under the same eternal stars. And so, dear traveler of dreams, as our long journey through the corridors of time draws to its gentle close, we find ourselves once more beside the eternal Nile, where moonlight dances on waters that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the dreams of kings and queens, the quiet persistence of human hope across the ages. The night air is soft and warm around us now, carrying the faint fragrance of desert flowers that bloom only in darkness, their petals opening to catch the silver light of stars that have watched over this ancient land since before humans first learned to shape clay into vessels or forge iron into tools. In this peaceful hour, when the bustle of day has given way to the deep quiet of evening, we can hear more clearly the whispers that have been calling to us throughout our journey, the voices of a civilization that speaks to us still across the vast expanse of centuries. Listen carefully, and you will hear them in the gentle rustle of palm fronds along the riverbank, in the soft lapping of water against the ancient stones of temple foundations, in the barely audible sigh of wind moving through the empty chambers of pyramids, where once the voices of priests rose in prayer to gods whose names are written in stars. These are not the sounds of ending, but of continuation. The eternal conversation between past and present that flows as surely as the river itself flows toward the distant sea. In the darkness that surrounds us, the monuments of ancient Nubia stand like patient guardians, their silhouettes etched against the star-filled sky. The Pyramids of Meroë and Napata, smaller and more intimate than their famous cousins at Giza, seem to hold conversations with the constellations, their pointed peaks reaching toward the same celestial patterns that guided the astronomers and architects of 3,000 years ago. Each stone was placed with purpose, each corridor designed with wisdom, each chamber crafted to last not just for years or decades, but for millennia. The temples, too, maintain their silent vigil through the night, their columns and doorways framing views of the desert that have remained essentially unchanged since the time when incense burned on their altars and the chanted prayers of worshippers echoed through their halls. In the starlight, the hieroglyphs and reliefs carved into their walls seem almost to move, as if the ancient stories they tell are stirring to life in the magical hour between day and night. But perhaps the most profound whispers come not from the grand monuments of kings and queens, but from the simpler traces of everyday life that archaeology continues to uncover. The pottery sherds scattered in ancient refuse pits, the grinding stones that once prepared grain for daily bread, the jewelry fragments that once adorned women whose names are lost, but whose humanity shines through the objects they treasured. These humble remnants speak to us with particular eloquence about the continuity of human experience across time. For in the end, what draws us most deeply to the story of ancient Nubia is not simply the magnificence of its achievements, impressive though they are, but the recognition that the people who created this civilization shared with us the same fundamental hopes and fears, dreams and struggles that defined human existence in any age. They sought beauty and meaning in their lives. They created art and literature and music that expressed their deepest feelings. They loved their families and mourned their losses. They faced uncertainty with courage and adapted to change with wisdom. The mothers who sang lullabies to their children in the ancient cities of Kerma and Napata used melodies that may not have been so different from those that echo through Nubian villages today. The craftsmen who shaped clay and metal in workshops along the river brought to their work the same pride and skill and dedication to excellence that drives artisans in every culture and every time. The scholars who studied the movements of stars and the flooding of the Nile were motivated by the same curiosity about the natural world that inspires scientists today. In this recognition of our shared humanity, we find perhaps the greatest gift that the ancient Nubians have left for us. Their story reminds us that human dignity and achievement are not the monopoly of any single culture or civilization, that creativity and wisdom have flourished in every corner of the world, that the capacity for greatness lies dormant in every human community, waiting only for the right circumstances to bloom into magnificent expression. The Black Pharaohs, who ruled Egypt with wisdom and justice, the Kandake queens, who led their people with strength and vision, the unknown architects who designed the pyramids that still stand after 2.5 millennia, the scribes who developed new forms of writing to record their thoughts and dreams. All these remind us that human potential is limitless when it is nurtured by education, supported by community, and expressed through institutions that value excellence and creativity. As we prepare to leave this ancient landscape and return to our own time and place, we carry with us more than just knowledge about a distant civilization. We carry inspiration, drawn from the example of people who faced challenges not unlike our own and who responded with ingenuity, persistence, and hope. We carry wisdom gleaned from observing how human societies adapt to change, how they preserve what is valuable from the past, while embracing what is necessary for the future. The environmental challenges that contributed to the decline of Meroë speak to contemporary concerns about sustainability and the careful stewardship of natural resources. The cultural synthesis that characterized Nubian civilization at its height offers models for how diverse communities can work together while maintaining their distinct identities. The artistic achievements of Nubian craftsmen demonstrate the power of cultural expression to transcend political boundaries and speak to universal human experiences. Most importantly, perhaps, the story of ancient Nubia challenges us to question our assumptions about the past and to remain open to discoveries that may overturn what we think we know about human history. For too long, the achievements of African civilizations were minimized or ignored by scholars who could not imagine that such sophistication could emerge from the continent they dismissed as primitive. The gradual recognition of Nubia's true significance reminds us that there are, undoubtedly, many other stories waiting to be discovered, many other civilizations whose achievements remain hidden beneath layers of prejudice and neglect thought in the gentle darkness that now embraces us. In the profound quiet of the desert night, we can sense the presence of all those untold stories, all those unrecognized achievements, all those voices that history has not yet learned to hear. They whisper to us from ancient sites that have not yet been excavated, from manuscripts that have not yet been translated, from oral traditions that have not yet been recorded, reminding us that the human story is far richer and more complex than any single narrative can contain. The stars above us, the same stars that shone down on the Pyramids of Meroë in their glory days, seem to pulse with the rhythm of this vast, unfinished story of human becoming. Each point of light represents not just a distant sun, but a moment of human achievement, a flash of creativity or wisdom or courage that has contributed to the long journey from our earliest beginnings to whatever future awaits us. And in this cosmic perspective, the civilization of ancient Nubia takes its place not as an isolated phenomenon, remarkable but disconnected from the broader human experience, but as one movement in the great symphony of human development, one voice in the ongoing conversation between generations, one chapter in the book that our species continues to write with each passing day. The Nile continues to flow past us in the darkness, its waters carrying toward the Mediterranean the accumulated memories of all the civilizations that have flourished along its banks. In its gentle murmur, we can hear echoes of every story we have shared on this journey, every moment of triumph and tragedy, every expression of hope and fear, every dream of transcendence, and every acceptance of limitation that has marked the human experience in this ancient land. But the river's song carries something else as well, something that speaks not just of the past, but of the future, not just of what has been, but of what might yet be. For just as the waters of the Nile are constantly renewed, constantly moving toward new destinations, while remaining fundamentally the same, so too the human story continues to unfold, each generation adding its own unique contributions to the great narrative of our species. The children who will wake tomorrow in the villages along the Nile will inherit not only the material legacy of their ancestors, but the spiritual inheritance as well, the accumulated wisdom and creativity and resilience that has been passed down through countless generations. They will face challenges that their ancestors could never have imagined, but they will meet those challenges with resources drawn from the deep wells of human experience that stretch back to the very beginnings of civilization. And perhaps, in some distant future, when archaeologists of another age examine the remains of our own civilization, they will find evidence of this same essential human spirit that we have glimpsed in the ruins of Kerma and Meroë, the same drive to create beauty and meaning, to reach beyond the limitations of individual existence toward something greater and more enduring. In this thought, there is great comfort and great hope, for it suggests that whatever challenges we may face, whatever difficulties may lie ahead, we are not alone in our struggles. We are connected across time and space to all those who have gone before us and all those who will come after us, part of a great community of human beings who share the same fundamental dignity and potential dot as you prepare now to drift into sleep, to let the gentle currents of dreams carry you toward whatever rest and renewal await in the quiet hours before dawn. Take with you this sense of connection to the great human story of which you are an essential part. Let the whispers of ancient Nubia remind you that you, too, are heir to traditions of wisdom and creativity that stretch back to the very beginnings of civilization. Let the example of the Black Pharaohs inspire you to pursue excellence in your own endeavors, to lead with justice and wisdom in whatever sphere of influence you may have. Let the memory of the Kandake queens encourage you to face challenges with courage and dignity, to stand up for what you believe is right, regardless of the obstacles you may encounter. Let the vision of Nubian artisans and scholars motivate you to add your own unique contributions to the ongoing human conversation, to create something of beauty or meaning that will enrich the lives of others and add to the great treasury of human achievement. Let the resilience of Nubian civilization in the face of environmental and political challenges remind you that adaptation and change are natural parts of life, that endings often contain within them the seeds of new beginnings. And let the gentle flow of the eternal Nile carry you now toward dreams filled with golden light and ancient wisdom, where the voices of pharaohs and queens, priests and merchants, craftsmen and farmers blend together in a timeless chorus that sings of the enduring power of the human spirit to create meaning and beauty in the face of time's inevitable passage. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that you are connected to this great river of human experience, that your own life adds its unique note to the eternal symphony that began in the ancient kingdoms of the Nile and continues still in every act of love and creativity, in every moment of wisdom and courage, in every dream of a better future for all humanity. The whispers of Nubia will watch over your sleep, carrying you gently through the night until morning comes again with its promise of new discoveries, new connections, new possibilities for adding your own chapter to the never-ending story of human becoming. Rest well, dear traveler, until the dawn calls you back to the waking world, enriched by your journey through the timeless realm where ancient wisdom meets eternal hope beside the flowing waters of the sacred river and in the deepest quiet of the desert night, where stars shine down on monuments that have witnessed the passage of empires and the persistence of dreams. The ancient land settles into peaceful slumber, its secrets safely held, its stories gently told, its whispers carrying on the wind that blows across the sands of time, connecting all who listen to the endless, beautiful mystery of human existence on this ancient earth.